The white Lamborghini pulled alongside the battered Camaro at the red light, and Preston Aldridge made the worst mistake of his life. He opened his mouth. What started as casual cruelty at a Scottsdale intersection turned into a $220 million bet captured on dashcam, a race that would expose decades of buried hatred, and the revelation that the nobody he mocked was once the fastest driver on Earth. Sometimes karma doesn't wait for the afterlife. Sometimes it shows up at a traffic light in a 1972 muscle car, and when the light turns green, everything you built on arrogance gets left in the dust. If you want to see how a single moment of cruelty destroyed an empire, stay until the end, and comment your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. The Arizona sun hammered down on East Camelback Road with the kind of relentless heat that made the asphalt shimmer like water. March in Scottsdale wasn't supposed to feel this brutal, but the thermometer outside the Paradise Valley Bank building read 94 degrees at 3:15 in the afternoon, and Preston Aldridge didn't care. He had the air conditioning in his Lamborghini Huracan cranked to Arctic levels, his Loro Piana sunglasses perched perfectly on his surgically refined nose, and the kind of smile that came from knowing he was untouchable. Preston Aldridge was 37 years old, 6'2", with the manufactured physique of someone who paid a private trainer $60,000 a year to make him look like he worked for it. His hair was styled in that deliberately casual way that required 45 minutes and 3 products every morning. His watch cost more than most people's cars. His car cost more than most people's houses. And he liked it that way. As CEO of Aldridge Capital Ventures, Preston had built a reputation for aggressive acquisitions, hostile takeovers, and a management style that treated employees like interchangeable parts in a machine designed to generate his wealth. The company's Glassdoor reviews were a horror show of discrimination complaints, retaliation stories, and tales of psychological warfare disguised as corporate culture. But Preston's father had taught him young. Lawsuits were just the cost of doing business, and if you had enough money, you could make anything disappear. The light at the intersection of Camelback and Scottsdale Road had just turned red when Preston noticed the car pulling up beside him in the right lane. A 1972 Chevrolet Camaro, faded blue paint covered in desert dust, primer spots visible on the rear quarter panel, a back bumper held on with zip ties. The kind of car Preston would have called tragic if he bothered to think about it at all. The kind of car that had no business existing in this neighborhood, where the median home price hovered around $3 million and the country club membership waiting list was 5 years long. Preston glanced over, his lip curling reflexively. Then he saw the driver, a black man, maybe late 30s or early 40s, wearing a plain white t-shirt and sunglasses, both hands on the wheel, eyes forward, not looking at Preston, not looking at anyone, just waiting for the light. Something ugly stirred in Preston's chest, that same feeling he got when he saw someone who didn't belong in his spaces, on his streets, in his world. His father had called it maintaining standards. Preston called it common sense. He rolled down his window. "Hey!" Preston's voice carried that particular tone of entitled aggression, loud enough to be heard but wrapped in a veneer of joviality, like he was just making friendly conversation. "You lost, buddy?" The man in the Camaro didn't respond, didn't even turn his head. Preston felt his jaw tighten. Being ignored was worse than being challenged. "I'm talking to you," he said louder now. "This your car, or did you borrow it from a junkyard?" Still nothing. The man's hands remained steady on the wheel, fingers relaxed, posture calm. The kind of calm that came from discipline, not fear. That made Preston angrier. "You know where you are," Preston continued, his voice taking on an edge. "This is Scottsdale, not Phoenix. We have standards here. That piece of shit you're driving is bringing down property values just sitting at the light." The man finally turned his head, just slightly, and looked at Preston through his sunglasses. His expression was unreadable. Then he turned back to face forward, saying nothing. Preston's face flushed red. "Oh, so you're deaf and driving junk? Perfect combination. Let me guess. On your way to apply for a job you're not qualified for? Or maybe you're lost looking for the charity car wash?" The light was still red. 30 seconds left on the countdown timer. The man in the Camaro reached forward and adjusted something on his dashboard, a small camera mounted near the rearview mirror. Then he spoke for the first time, his voice low and level, with the kind of quiet authority that made people lean in to hear. "I'm not lost." 3 words. That was all. But they carried weight. Preston laughed. That particular laugh wealthy men use when they want everyone to know they're in charge. "Right, sure. You belong here, in that car." He gestured dismissively at the Camaro. "What's it worth, 2,000? 3 if you find someone drunk enough to buy it?" "You done?" the man asked, his tone unchanged. "Done?" Preston's smile widened, sharpening into something cruel. "I'm just getting started. See, what bothers me is people like you thinking you can just drive through neighborhoods like this, like you own the place, like you've earned the right to breathe the same air we do. You haven't. That car is proof. You want to be here? Earn it. But you can't, can you? Because earning requires work. And judging by that trash heap, work isn't really your thing." 20 seconds on the countdown. The man in the Camaro was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned his head again, this time fully, and looked directly at Preston. When he spoke, his voice was still calm, but there was something underneath it now, something that made the hair on the back of Preston's neck stand up, even though he'd never admit it. "You think my car is junk?" It wasn't a question. Preston's grin was vicious. "I don't think, I know. That thing couldn't outrun a golf cart." "Then prove it," the man said simply. Preston blinked. "What?" "You heard me. You're driving something fast. You think my car is junk. Prove it." The man's lips curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile. "Race me." Preston laughed again, but this time there was genuine surprise mixed with delight. This was better than he'd hoped. "You're serious? You want to race that piece of shit against a Lamborghini?" "If you think you can handle it," the man replied. 10 seconds. Preston's mind was already racing ahead, calculating the social capital of this moment, the story he'd tell at the club, the photos he'd post, the absolute humiliation he could inflict. He'd destroy this guy, then make sure everyone knew about it. The thought filled him with electric satisfaction. "All right," Preston said, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "But let's make it interesting. You lose, and you will lose, you disappear. You don't drive through this neighborhood again. You don't show your face at any of the clubs, restaurants, or businesses where people like me spend money. You vanish. Understood?" The man considered this. "And if you lose?" Preston's laugh was explosive. "I won't, but sure, let's hear your fantasy. What do you want when I destroy you?" The man's expression didn't change. "Your company." Preston's laughter cut off abruptly. "What?" "Aldridge Capital Ventures. You lose, I own it. Every share, every asset, every contract." For 3 heartbeats, Preston just stared. Then the laughter came back, harder than before, almost hysterical. "You're insane. You don't even know who I am." "I know exactly who you are, Preston Aldridge," the man said quietly. "Just like I know your company is worth approximately $220 million, just like I know you think you're untouchable. So I'm asking, are you willing to back up all that talk, or is the Lamborghini just for show?" 5 seconds. Preston's face was crimson now, his ego fully engaged. No one talked to him like this. No one challenged him. And certainly no one driving a car held together with hope and zip ties got to question his courage. "Fine," Preston snarled. "You want to bet my entire company on a race? Done. But I'm not shaking your hand. I'm recording this so when I take you to court for harassment, I'll have proof you tried to extort me." He pulled out his phone and started recording. "State your terms," Preston demanded, his voice loud and clear for the camera. "Tell me exactly what you're betting and what you want when I win." The man turned to face his own dash cam, making sure it captured everything. Then he looked at Preston, his expression serene. "My name is Darius Kane," he said, his voice steady and clear. "You've spent the last 3 minutes insulting me, my car, and making assumptions about who I am and what I deserve. You challenged me to prove my car isn't junk. I'm accepting that challenge. You win, I'll never drive through this area again. I win, you sign over 100% ownership of Aldridge Capital Ventures to me. That's the bet. You've offered it. I've accepted it. We both have it recorded." The light turned green. Preston's foot hovered over the accelerator, his heart hammering with adrenaline and absolute certainty. This was going to be the best story of his life. "One lap around the Paradise Valley Loop," Preston said quickly, his voice sharp. "Starts here, ends at the bank parking lot where we started. First one back wins. No rules, no restrictions. And when I win, you're going to wish you'd kept your mouth shut and stayed in whatever neighborhood you crawled out of." Darius Kane didn't smile, didn't blink, just said 6 words that would haunt Preston Aldridge for the rest of his life. "I don't shake on bets. I finish them." Then he calmly reached down, and the sound that emerged from under the Camaro's hood made Preston's blood run cold. It wasn't the sound of a tired, dying engine. It wasn't the wheeze of a car barely clinging to life. It was the deep, brutal, barely contained roar of something that had been sleeping and just woke up hungry. The Camaro's exhaust note dropped 2 octaves, vibrating through the asphalt, rattling windows in nearby shops. The car seemed to squat lower on its suspension, like a predator preparing to strike. And in that moment, Preston Aldridge realized with sudden, awful clarity that he might have made a catastrophic mistake. But his foot was already on the gas, his ego was fully committed, and there was no backing down now. "Paradise Valley Loop," Preston said, his voice tight. "Right now." Darius Kane nodded once. Then he said, "After you." Preston didn't wait. He launched the Lamborghini forward, the 700 horsepower engine screaming as the car rocketed away from the intersection. The acceleration was savage, pinning him back in his seat, the sophisticated all-wheel drive system putting power down with mechanical perfection. The digital speedometer climbed through 60, 70, 80 miles per hour within seconds. Behind him, in his rearview mirror, he could see the Camaro following, but it wasn't keeping up, couldn't keep up. Preston grinned savagely. This was going exactly as he'd known it would. The Paradise Valley Loop was a roughly 7-mile circuit through some of the most expensive real estate in Arizona. Wide, smooth roads with gentle curves, perfectly maintained, exactly the kind of environment where raw horsepower mattered and an exotic supercar should dominate. Preston knew every inch of it. He drove it twice a week on his way to the club. He took the first turn fast, feeling the Lamborghini's computer systems managing every aspect of traction and balance, keeping him glued to the road with mechanical precision. The car was flawless. He was flawless. This was over before it started. Preston accelerated hard down the straightaway on Lincoln Drive, passing 110 miles per hour, watching the world blur past. He checked his mirror again, expecting to see the Camaro falling further behind. Instead, he saw it gaining. Not slowly, not struggling, just gaining. Preston frowned and pressed harder on the accelerator. The Lamborghini was already near its limit on these roads, but he had power to spare. The supercar responded instantly, surging forward. The Camaro kept gaining. "What the hell?" Preston muttered, his hands tightening on the wheel. The second turn was coming up, a long sweeping right-hander that led onto Mockingbird Lane. Preston took it at 90, feeling the Lamborghini's systems working overtime to keep the car stable, the computer flashing warnings about grip limits. He came out of the turn and looked in his mirror. The Camaro was 50 feet behind him. And it wasn't just following his line, it was closing the gap. Preston's breathing quickened. This wasn't possible. The physics didn't work. A 40-year-old Camaro with faded paint and zip-tied bumpers couldn't run with a modern supercar. It couldn't. But it was. The third turn was tighter, a left-hander onto Tatum Boulevard. Preston braked late, pushed the Lamborghini into the apex, felt the rear end start to step out as the computer systems fought to save him from his own aggression. He came out of the turn sideways, straightened the wheel, and hammered the throttle. And that's when Darius Kane showed him what driving actually looked like. The Camaro entered the same turn 10 miles per hour faster than Preston had dared. Instead of fighting the car or relying on computers, Darius used weight transfer, throttle control, and an understanding of physics that looked like telepathy. The Camaro rotated through the apex with perfect balance, the rear tires smoking just slightly as Darius transitioned from brake to throttle with precision that would have made engineers weep. The car didn't just exit the turn, it launched out of it. Preston watched in his mirror, his mouth dry, as the battered blue Camaro closed the distance between them like Preston was standing still. "No," Preston whispered. "No, no, no." They were coming up on the long straight on Lincoln again. the final mile before returning to the starting point. Preston had the Lamborghini pinned at 115 miles per hour. This was where he should pull away. This was where modern engineering and Italian craftsmanship should overwhelm old American iron. The Camaro pulled alongside him. Preston's head snapped to the side, and for one frozen moment, he made eye contact with Darius Kane. The other man's expression was completely calm, not grinning, not taunting, just driving. Like this was meditation, not combat. Then the Camaro accelerated, not slowly, not struggling. The car just pulled ahead like there was another gear Preston didn't know about, like the laws of physics had decided to take Darius's side in this particular argument. The sound from the engine was unearthly, not the refined scream of Preston's supercar, but something rawer, angrier, more honest. Preston watched, paralyzed, as the Camaro pulled one car length ahead, then two, then three. The finish line was dead ahead, the Paradise Valley Bank parking lot where this nightmare had started. Preston had the Lamborghini maxed out. There was nothing left. No secret reserve of power, no trick up his sleeve. Just the slowly growing distance between his $200,000 supercar and a 40-year-old muscle car that was supposed to be junk. Darius Kane crossed first, pulling into the parking lot with controlled precision, bringing the Camaro to a smooth stop right where they'd started. Preston crossed the line 14 seconds later. 14 seconds might not sound like much, but in racing, in any competitive context where skill mattered, 14 seconds was an eternity. It was the difference between a professional and an amateur, between someone who understood their machine and someone who just owned one. Preston pulled up beside the Camaro, his hands shaking, his breath coming in short gasps. For several seconds, neither man moved. Then Darius killed his engine, that monstrous, beautiful engine that had just humiliated everything Preston thought he knew, and stepped out of the car. He looked exactly the same as he had at the red light, calm, unhurried, unimpressed. Preston stayed in the Lamborghini, his mind racing. This couldn't be happening. He was Preston Aldridge. He didn't lose. He'd never lost. His entire life had been constructed around the principle that money, power, and confidence could overcome anything. But he just lost a race to a car held together with zip ties, and he'd bet his company on it, on camera. Darius walked over to Preston's window and made a small circular motion with his finger. Preston, moving like an automaton, rolled down the window. "You have the recording?" Darius asked quietly. Preston's mouth was dry. There was no bet. You tricked me. This was entrapment. I'll sue you for... "You have the recording?" Darius repeated, his voice unchanged. Preston's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "This isn't over." "Yes," Darius said simply. "It is. You made an offer. I accepted. We raced under terms you set. You lost, and we both recorded the whole thing." He tilted his head slightly. "You can walk away and pretend this didn't happen, but the recording exists, the bet exists, and I'll be very curious to see how that plays out if you try to deny it." Preston's vision was blurring around the edges. Panic was setting in. Real panic. The kind that came from realizing you'd just destroyed your own life with your mouth and your ego. "Nobody will believe you," he said, his voice cracking. "Nobody will enforce this. It's a street race. It's illegal. The whole thing is witnessed by traffic cameras, probably a dozen cell phones, and definitely both our dash cams," Darius finished. "You want to try explaining to a judge why you made that bet if you didn't intend to honor it? Or maybe you want to explain why you spent 3 minutes at a red light making racist assumptions and insults before challenging someone to a race." Preston felt his stomach drop. "I never said anything racist. You told me I didn't belong in this neighborhood," Darius said quietly. "You questioned why I was here. You called my car junk without knowing anything about it. You told me to disappear, to stay away from places where people like you spend money. You want that recording played in court? In public? Because I promise you, the internet will have opinions." Preston's breathing was getting harder. His vision narrowed. This couldn't be happening. "Who are you?" he whispered. Darius Kane regarded him for a long moment. Then he said, "Someone who knows the difference between value and price, between skill and money, between who people are and what they drive." He paused. and someone who's very familiar with the Aldridge family's history of destroying people who don't have the resources to fight back. Preston's blood ran cold. What are you talking about? We'll get to that, Darius said. But first, you're going to call your lawyer, because in 72 hours, I'm filing paperwork to collect on our bet, and you're going to honor it, or everyone, your investors, your employees, your country club friends, the board members who think you're some kind of business genius, they're all going to see exactly who you are when you lose. Preston's hand moved almost without thought, reaching for his phone. Not to call his lawyer, to call the police. Because when Preston Aldridge was cornered, when he'd miscalculated, when he'd bet everything and lost, he did what he'd always done, what his father had taught him to do. He weaponized the system against anyone who dared to challenge him. 911, what's your emergency? Preston's voice shifted instantly. Fear, urgency, just the right amount of distress. Yes, I'm at the Paradise Valley Bank parking lot on Camelback Road. There's a man in a beat-up Camaro who just threatened me, forced me into some kind of illegal race, and now he's trying to extort me. I think he might be dangerous. Please send someone immediately. Darius didn't move, didn't run, didn't even look concerned. He just stood there, hands visible, posture relaxed, and waited. The sirens took 4 minutes to arrive. 2 Scottsdale police cruisers pulled into the parking lot, lights flashing. 4 officers emerged, hands near their weapons, scanning the scene with professional caution. That's him, Preston said immediately, pointing at Darius from inside his Lamborghini. He threatened me, forced me to race, and now he's trying to claim I owe him money. I want him arrested. The nearest officer, a young man with dark hair and skeptical eyes, approached Darius first. Sir, I need you to keep your hands where I can see them and step away from the vehicle. Darius complied immediately, moving slowly, keeping his hands visible. Officer, I'd like to show you something, but I need your permission to reach into my car for my phone and dash cam recording. The officer nodded carefully. Slowly, Darius reached through the Camaro's window and retrieved his phone. Then he looked at the officer and said quietly, Before you make any decisions, I think you should watch this. The gentleman in the Lamborghini is Preston Aldridge, CEO of Aldridge Capital Ventures. At the red light on Camelback and Scottsdale, approximately 15 minutes ago, he initiated an interaction with me that led to the race he's now claiming I forced him into. Everything is recorded, both on my dash cam and his phone. The officer's expression shifted slightly, more cautious now, more analytical. You're saying you have video evidence? Yes, sir. And so does he. The officer looked at Preston. Sir, did you record the interaction? Preston's face flushed. I recorded him threatening me, yes. He tried to extort. Can I see the recording, sir? Preston hesitated, his mind racing. The recording showed everything, every word, every insult, every detail of the bet. If he showed it, he was finished. If he didn't, he looked like a liar. I don't think that's necessary, Preston said, his voice tight. He's clearly a criminal. He's trying to... Sir, the officer interrupted, his tone cooling. If you've made an accusation and you have evidence, I need to see it. Otherwise, I need to hear both sides. Darius held out his phone. Officer, with your permission, I'd like to show you my dashcam footage. It shows the entire interaction, unedited, from the moment Mr. Aldridge pulled up beside me at the red light. The officer took the phone and watched. His expression changed incrementally, surprise, then disbelief, then something that looked like disappointment. He watched the whole thing. Preston's initial taunts, the escalating insults, the challenge, the bet, the race. When it finished, the officer looked at Preston with an expression that was no longer even remotely sympathetic. Mr. Aldridge, he said quietly, according to this recording, you initiated contact with Mr. Kane. You insulted him repeatedly. You challenged him to a race with specific terms. He accepted. You both participated voluntarily, and now you're claiming he threatened you? Preston's voice rose desperately. He manipulated me. He didn't say a word until you'd spent 3 minutes insulting him, the officer said flatly. And when he did speak, he simply accepted a challenge you made. Where exactly is the threat? The bet is illegal, Preston almost shouted. You can't enforce... I'm not here to enforce a bet, the officer said. I'm here because you called 911 and claimed someone threatened you, but this recording shows that's not what happened. He looked at Darius, then back at Preston. What this recording shows is that you made a series of questionable statements, challenged someone to an illegal race, made a verbal contract, and lost. Those are civil matters, not criminal ones, unless you want me to cite you both for street racing. Preston's world was crumbling. You don't understand who I am. I understand exactly who you are, the officer said, his voice cold now. I've read the complaints filed against your company. I've seen the news stories about your business practices. And now I've seen you try to weaponize police response against someone who beat you at a game you started. He handed the phone back to Darius. Mr. Kane, are you in danger from Mr. Aldridge? No, officer. Do you need police assistance with anything? No, officer, but I would like to note that he did call 911 with a false report. The officer looked at Preston. Mr. Aldridge, filing a false police report is a crime. Given what I've seen on this recording, I could charge you, but I'm going to give you an opportunity to resolve this civilly. I suggest you contact your attorney and work out whatever agreement you made with Mr. Kane, and I suggest you don't call 911 again unless you have an actual emergency. Preston sat in his Lamborghini, his face the color of old paper, his hands trembling. Everything was falling apart. Everything he'd built, everything he'd relied on, was collapsing because he'd decided to mock someone at a red light. The officers left. Darius Kane stood beside his battered Camaro, arms crossed, waiting. Preston knew what he had to do. He could already feel his mind working through the angles, the strategies, the ways to fight this. He had lawyers, expensive ones. He had connections. He had power. He would destroy Darius Kane, bury him in litigation, make his life hell. Because Preston Aldridge didn't lose. He wouldn't start now. He looked at Darius through the window, and when he spoke, his voice was pure venom. You have no idea what you just started, no idea who you're dealing with. I'm going to make you regret every second of this. Darius Kane looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then he said something that made Preston's blood run cold. Your father said the same thing to mine, 32 years ago, at this exact country club. Right before he destroyed my father's reputation with a lie, got him banned from every professional opportunity in this city, and drove him to an early grave. Darius's voice was still quiet, still calm, but there was something underneath it now, something old and patient and absolutely implacable. So when you say I don't know who I'm dealing with, Preston, understand something. I've known exactly who you are since the day you were born, and I've been waiting a very long time for this moment. Then Darius Kane got back in his Camaro, started that magnificent engine, and drove away, leaving Preston Aldridge sitting alone in his expensive car in an expensive parking lot, realizing for the first time in his privileged, protected life that money and ego couldn't save him from the consequences of his own choices. The recording would go viral within 48 hours. The lawsuits would start within 72. And Preston Aldridge's empire, built on cruelty, maintained by intimidation, protected by wealth, was about to learn what happened when someone finally refused to disappear. But that was just the beginning. Because Darius Kane wasn't just a man who'd won a race, he was a ghost from the past who'd been waiting 3 decades to settle a debt. And he'd just been given the keys to everything Preston owned. The glass doors of Aldridge Capital Ventures' downtown Phoenix headquarters had been designed to intimidate, 20 feet of polished steel and bulletproof transparency that cost $40,000 per panel. Preston stormed through them at 8:30 the following morning, looking like a man who hadn't slept, because he hadn't. His Brioni suit was wrinkled, his eyes were bloodshot, and his hands shook slightly as he jabbed the elevator button with more force than necessary. Mr. Aldridge. His executive assistant, Margaret, a woman in her 50s who'd worked for his father before him, stood up from her desk as he approached. Your attorney called 3 times already this morning. He said it's urgent that you— I know what it's about, Preston snapped, brushing past her into his corner office. Get Richard on the phone, now, and I don't want to be disturbed by anyone else. Margaret's expression flickered with something that might have been concern, but she nodded and retreated to her desk. Preston slammed his office door hard enough to rattle the frame and went straight to the bar cart in the corner, pouring 3 fingers of scotch into a crystal tumbler despite the early hour. His hands were steadier after the first swallow. The desk phone buzzed. "Mr. Harrington, on line 1, Margaret's voice said through the speaker. Preston grabbed the receiver. "Richard, tell me you found a way out of this." Richard Harrington had been the Aldridge family's attorney for 23 years. He'd defended Preston's father through 2 discrimination lawsuits, a sexual harassment complaint, and an SEC investigation. His voice on the phone was measured and careful in the way that meant bad news was coming. "Preston, I've reviewed the recording you sent me multiple times, and I've consulted with 3 other attorneys, including our litigation specialist. And you're in a very difficult position." Preston's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles went white. "That's not what I pay you $600 an hour to tell me. I pay you to fix things. So fix this." "Preston, listen to me very carefully." Richard's voice remained maddeningly calm. "You made a verbal contract in a public place. You stated clear terms. You repeated those terms to ensure understanding. The other party accepted. You both participated in the agreed-upon action, and you lost. All of this is captured on video with clear audio from multiple angles. This isn't a situation where there's ambiguity or room for interpretation." "It was a joke," Preston said desperately. "I was mocking him. No one actually bets their company on a street race. Any judge will see that." "Will they?" Richard asked quietly. "Because what the recording shows is you making increasingly specific statements about what you'd wager, recording him on your phone while doing so, and engaging in the activity that would determine the outcome. It also shows you initiating contact, making multiple statements that could be interpreted as racially motivated, and becoming more aggressive when he didn't respond the way you wanted." Preston felt his stomach twist. "You're saying I can't fight this?" "I'm saying that if you fight this and lose, which is likely, the publicity will be catastrophic. Every word you said at that red light will be played in court. Every business decision you've made will be scrutinized through that lens. Every former employee who's ever filed a complaint will suddenly have renewed motivation to speak publicly." Richard paused. "Preston, the best-case scenario here is that you settle quickly, quietly, and hope this doesn't become national news." "Settle?" Preston's voice rose to a near shout. "You want me to just hand over my entire company to some nobody because of a street race? I want you to avoid prison time for filing a false police report, avoid a public trial that will destroy your reputation beyond repair, and potentially negotiate terms that allow you to maintain some equity position or consulting role." Richard's voice hardened slightly. "And Preston, that nobody you're referring to? I did some research on Darius Kane last night. You need to know who you're actually dealing with." Preston's throat went dry. "What do you mean?" Darius Kane was a Formula One driver from 2008 to 2014. He won the World Championship in 2012. He was the 3rd black driver in F1 history and one of the most naturally talented racers of his generation. He retired at the peak of his career. No one really knows why, though there were rumors about family tragedy and disillusionment with the sport. Since then, he's been running a nonprofit called the Kane Racing Academy, teaching underprivileged kids how to race and providing scholarships for automotive education. Preston's hand went numb. The phone nearly slipped from his grip. That can't be. It's him. I confirmed it with 3 separate sources. The man you called junk and told to disappear from your neighborhood is a former world champion who forgot more about driving in his rookie year than you'll ever know." Richard let that sink in. "And Preston, there's something else. Something you need to understand about why he came after you specifically." "What?" Preston whispered. "Do you remember a man named Marcus Kane? Worked as a mechanic at Paradise Valley Country Club in the early 1990s? Preston's mind raced backward through hazy memories. His father had mentioned something about an incident at the club. Vaguely, why? Because Marcus Kane was Darius's father, and in 1993, your father accused him of stealing a Rolex from a locker room. Marcus was arrested, charged, and even though the charges were eventually dropped due to lack of evidence, the accusation destroyed his reputation. He couldn't find work anywhere in Scottsdale, lost his home. His family fell apart. He died of a heart attack in 1998 at 46 years old, broken, unemployed, and still carrying the stigma of a crime he didn't commit. The scotch in Preston's stomach turned to acid. How do you know he didn't do it? Because 3 years after Marcus died, a club member's son confessed on his deathbed to stealing multiple items from the locker room, including that Rolex. The confession was witnessed and documented. Your father knew about it. He was on the board when the information came to light, and he voted to bury it rather than clear Marcus Kane's name. Preston sank into his leather chair, his legs suddenly unable to hold him. Dad never told me any of this. Why would he? It made him look bad. But Darius Kane knows. He's known for decades. And yesterday, at that red light, you gave him exactly what he's been waiting for, an opportunity to take everything from an Aldridge the way an Aldridge took everything from his father. Preston's voice was barely audible. What do I do? Richard was quiet for a long moment. You prepare. Because in approximately 48 hours, based on the pattern I'm seeing, this video is going to go public. And when it does, your life is going to change in ways you can't imagine. Can't you suppress it? Injunction, cease and desist, something? On what grounds? He's a private citizen sharing a video of a public interaction. Unless you want to argue the video defames you, which would require proving the content is false, which it isn't, there's no legal mechanism to stop him. Richard's tone shifted, becoming almost gentle. Preston, I need you to understand something. Your father spent 30 years building a reputation as someone who was above consequences. Someone who could do whatever he wanted because money and connections made him bulletproof. But times have changed. Social media changed them. One video, shared widely enough, can destroy a career overnight. And the video you created yesterday is going to do exactly that. Preston closed his eyes. How bad? Catastrophic. Every investor will want to distance themselves. Every client will reconsider their relationship. Your board will demand your resignation. The discrimination lawsuits that have been settled quietly over the years will suddenly seem like a pattern rather than isolated incidents. And Darius Kane will have more public support than you can possibly fight. Then what's the point? Preston asked bitterly. If it's already over, why am I even paying you? Because I can potentially negotiate a settlement that allows you to walk away with something. A few million. A consulting position. Something that gives you a foundation to rebuild from. Richard paused. But you need to accept reality first. This isn't a fight you can win. The only question is how much you'll lose. Preston hung up without responding, his mind spinning. This couldn't be happening. 48 hours ago, he'd been untouchable. Now he was sitting in his office drinking scotch at 8:30 in the morning while his attorney explained how his entire world was about to collapse because of 30 seconds of ego at a red light. His phone buzzed. A text message from a number he didn't recognize. Check your email. DK. Preston's hand shook as he opened his laptop. The email was waiting, sent from a simple Gmail address with no subject line. The body contained a single link to a private YouTube video and 3 sentences. This goes public in 36 hours unless you contact me to arrange settlement discussions. Your choice. Negotiate in private or explain yourself to the world. The clock is running. Preston clicked the link. The video was the dash cam footage from Darius's Camaro, edited professionally with subtitles highlighting every word Preston had said, every insult, every assumption, every detail of the bet. It was damning. More than damning. It was career suicide captured in high definition. The caption below read, "Sometimes karma catches up at a red light. Full story coming soon." Preston stared at the screen, his breathing shallow, his mind racing through options that were dwindling by the second. He could ignore it, let Darius post it and try to weather the storm. He could fight it, throw lawyers and money at the problem until something stuck. Or he could negotiate, try to minimize the damage before it went nuclear. His office door opened without a knock. Margaret stood in the doorway, her face pale. "Mr. Aldridge, you need to see this." She held up her phone. The screen showed a Twitter thread from a journalist named Sarah Chen, an investigative reporter for the Arizona Republic who'd written multiple exposés on corporate misconduct. The first tweet read, "Working on a story about a Scottsdale CEO who made a bet he couldn't win and a verbal contract he doesn't want to honor. Involves allegations of racism, abuse of 911 system, and a family history that goes back decades. Stay tuned." The tweet had been posted 18 minutes ago. It already had 12,000 retweets. Preston felt the room spin. How did she... It's already spreading, Margaret said quietly. 3 of our board members have called. 2 major clients have requested immediate meetings, and someone leaked internal emails to the Republic. Complaints from former employees about your management style, discrimination allegations that were settled with NDAs, everything. Preston's phone started ringing, then Margaret's desk phone, then his cell phone. The sounds overlapped, creating a cacophony of incoming disaster. Hold all calls, Preston said, his voice hollow. All of them. Margaret hesitated. Mr. Aldridge, one of them is from Silverman at Mountain Capital. He's your largest investor. He said, I don't care what he said. Hold all calls. Margaret left, closing the door softly. Preston sat in silence, surrounded by the muted buzzing of phones. He wasn't answering, staring at the video that was going to destroy everything he'd built. 36 hours. That's what Darius had given him. 36 hours to decide how he wanted this to end. Preston opened a new email and typed 3 words. Let's meet, tonight. He sent it to the Gmail address Darius had used, then poured himself another scotch and waited. The response came back in 4 minutes. Desert Ridge Community Center, 8 p.m. Come alone. Bring your attorney if you must, but know that everything said will be recorded. This isn't a negotiation about whether you pay, only about how and when. Preston read it 3 times, each time feeling something inside him crack a little more. The language was clear, clinical, the tone of someone who'd already won and was simply allowing the loser time to accept it. He thought about his father, the way Maxwell Aldridge had moved through the world with absolute confidence, never doubting his right to take what he wanted, never questioning whether consequences might someday arrive. His father had taught him that power was the only currency that mattered, that being right mattered less than being willing to crush anyone who challenged you. His father had been wrong. Preston called Richard back. Set up the meeting, tonight at 8. And Richard, bring everything you have on what I can actually salvage from this. Because I think you were right. This is a fight I've already lost. But Desert Ridge Community Center sat on the northern edge of Phoenix, a modest building that served as a hub for youth programs, educational workshops, and community events. It was the last place Preston had ever expected to negotiate the destruction of his empire. The parking lot was nearly empty when he arrived at 7:50, driving a rented Toyota instead of the Lamborghini because Richard had insisted on discretion. Richard was already there, standing beside his own car, looking grim. I've prepared 3 different settlement frameworks, he said without preamble. All of them assume you're transferring majority control. The question is whether you retain any equity position, consulting rights, or severance package. Just get me out of this with something, Preston said quietly. I don't care what it costs. They walked together into the building. A young woman at the front desk directed them to a conference room on the 2nd floor. When they entered, Darius Kane was already seated at the far end of a long table, flanked by 2 other people, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes, and a younger man in his 30s wearing a suit that had seen better days but fit him like it mattered. Darius stood as they entered. Mr. Aldridge, Mr. Harrington, thank you for coming. This is Sylvia Morrison, my attorney, and James Chen, who will be documenting this meeting. Sylvia Morrison. Preston recognized the name immediately, one of the most feared civil rights attorneys in Arizona, known for taking on corporations and winning judgments that made headlines. The younger man, James Chen, looked familiar too, and it took Preston a moment to place him. Sarah Chen's brother, the journalist's sibling, which meant this was already connected to the story that was about to break. Before we begin, Sylvia said, her voice crisp and professional, let's establish ground rules. This meeting is being recorded with everyone's knowledge and consent. Anything said here can and will be used in court proceedings if necessary. If you're not comfortable with these terms, you're free to leave. Richard glanced at Preston, who nodded slightly. We accept the terms. Good. Sylvia opened a leather portfolio and pulled out several documents. Then let's be clear about why we're here. 3 days ago, my client accepted a verbal contract offered by your client. The terms were explicit. A race between 2 vehicles, winner take all, with Mr. Aldridge's company as the wager if he lost. He lost. We're here to determine how that contract will be fulfilled. Richard cleared his throat. With respect, Ms. Morrison, No court is going to enforce a bet made during a street race. The entire premise is illegal. You're absolutely right, Sylvia said calmly, which is why we're not approaching this as a gambling debt. We're approaching it as a verbal contract made under duress. Preston frowned. What duress? He's the one claiming I owe him. The duress you created, Sylvia interrupted smoothly. When you spent 3 minutes at a red light harassing my client with racially charged comments, questioning his right to exist in your neighborhood, and pressuring him into accepting a challenge you initiated. Any reasonable person would interpret that as coercion, using social pressure, implied threat, and your position of privilege to force someone into a situation where refusing would validate your harassment. Richard's expression shifted. He saw where this was going. That's a creative interpretation. It's the interpretation that will resonate with a jury, Sylvia replied, especially when they watch the unedited footage of Mr. Aldridge initiating the entire interaction, escalating when my client didn't respond, and making increasingly aggressive statements until my client felt compelled to accept the challenge just to end the harassment. She smiled slightly. Of course, if you'd like to test that in court, we're prepared. The video will be Exhibit A. The false police report will be Exhibit B. And the pattern of discrimination complaints against Aldridge Capital Ventures will be Exhibit C through about Q. Preston felt his last hope crumbling. What do you want? Darius spoke for the first time since the meeting began. I want what you bet. 100% ownership of Aldridge Capital Ventures, transferred cleanly and completely within 30 days. That's insane, Preston said, his voice rising. Do you have any idea what that company is worth? What it would take to actually run it? $220 million, give or take, Darius said calmly. And yes, I know what it takes to run it. I've spent the last 3 days reviewing every filing, every contract, every complaint, and every financial statement available through public records. I know your company is overleveraged, underperforming, and surviving primarily on reputation rather than actual results. I know you've settled 17 discrimination complaints in the last 6 years. I know your employee turnover rate is 63%. I know 4 of your board members are only there because your father installed them before he died. He leaned forward slightly. What I'm offering you, Preston, is a chance to walk away from a company that's already failing. I'm going to restructure it, clean it up, and actually make it into something sustainable. You can either be part of that process in a limited capacity, or you can fight me and watch it collapse publicly while you're buried in litigation. Preston looked at Richard desperately. Richard's expression was grave. Preston, if even half of what they're suggesting is true, fighting this will expose problems that go far beyond one street race. If they bring pattern of discrimination evidence, if former employees feel emboldened to speak publicly, if the financial irregularities I've been worried about for years come to light, he trailed off meaningfully. What financial irregularities? Preston asked, his voice barely a whisper. The ones I've advised you repeatedly to address, Richard said quietly. The questionable expense reports, the contracts awarded to your friends' companies without competitive bidding, the consulting fees that look like kickbacks. Nothing criminal, yet, but enough to destroy whatever reputation you have left if it becomes public. Preston felt the walls closing in. So, what are my options? Sylvia slid a document across the table. You sign over full ownership. In exchange, you receive a severance package of $5 million paid over 3 years, a written agreement that Mr. Kane will not pursue legal action for the false police report or defamation for any statements you made during the recorded interaction, and a guarantee that the video will not be released publicly as long as you fulfill the terms of this agreement. $5 million? Preston's laugh was bitter. My company is worth $220 million, and you're offering me 5? Your company is worth $220 million on paper, Darius said quietly. In reality, based on actual performance and liabilities, it's worth about half that. And after the video goes public, which it will if we don't reach agreement, it'll be worth substantially less. The $5 million is more than fair, and you know it. Preston stared at the document. Everything he'd built, everything his father had left him, reduced to a few pages of legal text and a payout that wouldn't even cover his country club dues for 10 years. Why? He asked quietly, looking at Darius. Why does it have to be everything? Why can't we find some middle ground? Darius was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Do you remember what you told me at that red light? that I didn't belong, that I should disappear, that people like me needed to earn the right to exist in your spaces. Preston looked away, unable to hold his gaze. Your father told mine the same things, Darius continued. Different words maybe, but the same message, that we were less than, that we were suspect, that we didn't deserve dignity or justice, or even the benefit of the doubt. My father spent 5 years trying to clear his name after your father destroyed him. 5 years of rejection, shame, and doors closing in his face. He died believing the world saw him as a thief. Darius's voice remained level, but something burned underneath it. 3 years after he died, evidence came to light that would have exonerated him completely. Your father had that evidence. He could have cleared my father's name. He chose not to. He chose to let a dead man continue carrying shame for a crime he didn't commit because acknowledging the truth would have meant admitting he'd been wrong. Preston felt something cold settle in his chest. I didn't know. You didn't care, Darius corrected gently. And that's worse. You inherited your father's worldview without ever questioning whether it was right. You inherited his company without earning it. You inherited his prejudices without examining them. And when you saw me at that red light, you didn't see a person. You saw someone you could diminish to make yourself feel bigger. I'm sorry, Preston whispered. I don't want your apology, Darius said. I want your company. I want to take everything your father built on cruelty and corruption and turn it into something that actually creates value instead of extracting it from people who can't fight back. That's the only justice that means anything. Sylvia tapped the document. Mr. Aldridge, you have 2 choices. Sign this agreement tonight, or we proceed with litigation that will destroy whatever's left of your reputation. The video goes public, the complaints become front-page news, and you spend the next 3 years in court fighting a battle you've already lost. Preston looked at Richard. His attorney nodded slowly. It's the best option you have. Maybe the only option. Preston's hand shook as he picked up the pen Sylvia offered. He read through the document one more time, each paragraph another nail in the coffin of everything he'd thought was permanent. Then he signed. His signature felt like surrender. Darius witnessed it, then added his own signature. Sylvia and Richard did the same. James Chen documented everything with photographs and written notes. The transfer will be complete within 30 days, Sylvia said, gathering the documents. You'll need to notify your board, your employees, and your investors. We'll prepare a statement that frames this as a retirement decision. You'll endorse it publicly. In exchange, the video remains private. Preston stood on unsteady legs. What happens to the company? It gets better, Darius said simply. The employees who've been mistreated will be treated fairly. The clients who've been overcharged will get honest service. The practices that made your company profitable but toxic will end, and the money that would have gone to your pocket will go to programs that actually help people. Preston wanted to argue, wanted to fight, wanted to do anything except accept that this was really happening. But he was exhausted, hollowed out, defeated not just by losing the race, but by understanding finally that he deserved to lose it. One question, Preston said quietly. The Camaro. What's actually under the hood? Darius's lips curved into the faintest smile. A fully built 572 cubic inch big block with aluminum heads, custom cam, forged internals, and about 850 horsepower on pump gas. My father and I built that engine together when I was 15. It was supposed to be his retirement project. He never got to see it finished. He paused. The car looks like junk because I wanted people to underestimate it. Just like they underestimated him. Just like you underestimated me. Preston nodded slowly. It was never a fair fight. No, Darius agreed. But you didn't want fair. You wanted easy. You wanted to humiliate someone you thought couldn't fight back. You just picked the wrong person. They left the conference room in silence, Preston and Richard heading toward a future that was suddenly, terrifyingly uncertain, while Darius and his team remained behind to finalize details that would reshape an entire company. In the parking lot, Richard put a hand on Preston's shoulder. For what it's worth, you made the right choice. Fighting this would have destroyed you. I'm already destroyed, Preston said quietly. No, you're humbled. There's a difference. What you do next determines which one you become. Preston drove home alone in his rented Toyota. the city lights blurring past, his mind spinning with everything he'd lost and nothing he'd gained except the bitter clarity of consequence, finally arriving after a lifetime of outrunning it. The video wouldn't be released, his name wouldn't be destroyed publicly, but privately, he was finished, and everyone who mattered would know it within days. He thought about his father, about Maxwell Aldridge's absolute certainty that power meant immunity, that money bought silence, that people like the Canes could be crushed without consequence. His father had been wrong, and that wrongness had been inherited like everything else, passed down through generations, until someone finally refused to accept it. Preston parked in his driveway, looked at his house, 5,000 square feet of expensive architecture that suddenly felt hollow, and wondered what you did when everything you'd built your identity around turned out to be borrowed authority you'd never actually earned. 36 hours ago, he'd been a CEO. Now he was just a man who'd lost a race he should never have started and was finally learning what his father never did. That being rich didn't make you right, being powerful didn't make you safe, and eventually, always, the people you stepped on stopped moving out of your way. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. on Thursday, exactly 5 days after the red light encounter that had ended Preston's world. He sat at the head of the polished mahogany table in the Aldridge Capital Ventures conference room for what would be the last time, watching 7 faces register varying degrees of shock, anger, and calculation as Richard Harrington explained the situation with clinical precision. "To be absolutely clear," said Gerald Silverman, the company's largest outside investor and a man whose family had been friends with the Aldridges for 3 generations, "you're telling us that Preston bet this entire company on a street race and lost?" "That's an oversimplification," Richard said carefully, "but fundamentally accurate." Jesus Christ. Silverman sat back hard in his chair, his face reddening. "Preston, what were you thinking?" Preston's mouth was dry. He'd rehearsed this moment with Richard a dozen times, practiced the words that would make it sound less insane, but now that he was actually here, surrounded by people whose wealth and influence had always made him feel invincible by association, the words stuck in his throat. "I made a mistake," he said finally. "A significant one. But the agreement has been signed. Mr. Kane will assume full ownership in 23 days, and I'll be stepping down effective immediately." "You'll be stepping down?" Catherine Park, the company's CFO and the only board member under 50, looked at Preston with barely concealed contempt. "Preston, you don't get to frame this as a voluntary retirement. You gambled away $200 million in assets because someone hurt your feelings at a traffic light." "It wasn't like that," Preston started, but his voice lacked conviction even to his own ears. "Then what was it like?" Catherine's tone was ice. "Because I've spent the last 18 hours reviewing every communication, every settlement, every complaint that's been filed against this company in the 6 years you've been CEO, and you know what I found? A pattern. A very clear, very ugly pattern of you treating people exactly the way you treated this Darius Kane. With contempt, with assumptions, with the absolute certainty that your last name and your bank account meant you could say anything and do anything without consequences." Preston felt the room's energy shift. This wasn't shock anymore. This was fury looking for a target, and he was the only one available. "Catherine, that's not fair," Gerald started, but she cut him off. "Isn't it? We've paid out over $4 million in discrimination settlements in the last 6 years. $4 million. That's not counting the cases where we strong-arm people into signing NDAs before they could even file formal complaints. How many of those do you think are going to resurface now? How many former employees are going to feel emboldened to speak publicly once they know Preston doesn't control the company anymore?" The silence that followed was devastating. Richard cleared his throat. "Which is precisely why Mr. Kane's attorneys insisted on a statement framing this as a planned transition. If we handle this correctly, we can minimize the reputational damage, and—" "There is no we anymore, Richard," Catherine interrupted. "Preston signed away the company. That means in 3 weeks, Darius Kane owns every share, every asset, every decision. The only question I have is why any of us should stay to help manage this disaster." "Because," said a new voice from the doorway, "the alternative is watching everything collapse while you're explaining to your next employer why you jumped ship at the first sign of trouble." Everyone turned. Darius Kane stood in the conference room entrance wearing dark jeans, a simple gray button-down shirt, and an expression of absolute calm. Behind him stood Sylvia Morrison and a younger black woman in her early 30s carrying a leather portfolio. Preston felt his stomach drop. "What are you doing here?" "Attending a board meeting," Darius said simply, walking into the room. "As of this morning, I own 49% of this company through an accelerated transfer agreement your attorney signed at 2 a.m. In 23 days, I'll own the remaining 51%. Until then, I thought it would be helpful if I introduced myself to the people who will be working for me." He pulled out a chair, not at the head of the table where Preston sat, but in the middle, equidistant from everyone, and sat down with the easy confidence of someone who knew he'd already won. Sylvia and the younger woman took seats beside him. Gerald Silverman found his voice first. "You can't just walk into a private board meeting." "Actually," Sylvia said pleasantly, "as a majority shareholder, or near enough, Mr. Kane has every right to attend board meetings. It's in your corporate bylaws, Section 4, Paragraph 3. I checked." Catherine Park was studying Darius with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and reassessment. "You're really going to do this? Take over a company you won in a bet?" "I'm really going to do this," Darius confirmed, though I'd characterize it less as winning a bet and more as accepting an offer that was made recklessly and collecting what was promised. He gestured to the young woman beside him. "This is Jasmine Williams. She'll be serving as interim COO during the transition. She has an MBA from Stanford, 10 years of experience in corporate restructuring, and a particular talent for identifying inefficiencies." Jasmine nodded politely to the room. "I've reviewed your financials. There's significant work to be done." "Work?" Gerald's voice rose. "You're talking about dismantling everything Maxwell Aldridge built, everything this company stands for." "No," Darius said quietly. "I'm talking about dismantling everything that's kept this company profitable despite itself. The intimidation tactics, the discrimination, the practice of paying settlements instead of addressing systemic problems. The culture that treats employees as expendable and clients as resources to extract rather than relationships to maintain." He paused, letting that sink in. What Maxwell Aldridge built was a machine for converting cruelty into capital. I'm going to turn it into something sustainable. Preston watched this happening with a surreal sense of detachment, like he was observing his own funeral from a distance. These were his board members, his conference room, his company. Except none of it was his anymore, and everyone in the room could feel the power dynamic shifting in real time. "You have no experience running a company of this size," Gerald said, but his voice had lost its edge. He was grasping now, looking for purchase in a situation that was already decided. "You're right," Darius agreed. "I don't, but I have experience building organizations from nothing. The Kane Racing Academy started 7 years ago with 3 students, a used trailer, and $12,000 I scraped together from my savings. Today it's a nationally recognized nonprofit with 230 students, 18 full-time staff, and partnerships with 6 major universities. I understand how to create value, how to develop talent, and how to build something that lasts because it serves people rather than exploiting them." He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a harder edge. "What I don't have experience with is paying settlements to cover up discrimination, or manipulating contracts to squeeze extra fees from clients, or creating hostile work environments that make talented people quit within 6 months. So yes, there will be changes. Significant ones. The question you all need to answer is whether you want to be part of building something better, or whether you want to walk away and let everyone know you chose money over integrity." The room was silent. Catherine Park broke it. "What kind of changes?" Darius nodded to Jasmine, who opened her portfolio and pulled out a bound document. "We've prepared a preliminary restructuring plan. It includes immediate ethics training for all management, third-party review of all active discrimination complaints with an eye toward resolution rather than suppression, renegotiation of client contracts to ensure fair pricing, implementation of transparent promotion criteria, and establishment of an employee advisory board with actual decision-making authority." She slid copies across the table to each board member. "It also includes a complete audit of all financial relationships to identify conflicts of interest, review of all vendor contracts awarded without competitive bidding, an examination of executive compensation to ensure it's aligned with performance rather than tenure." Preston watched Gerald flip through the document, his face growing progressively more ashen, Half the things Jasmine had just mentioned would directly implicate decisions Gerald had supported or benefited from over the years. "This is a witch hunt," Gerald said finally. "You're coming in here with predetermined conclusions, and I'm coming in here with data," Jasmine interrupted calmly. "Employee turnover rates that are triple the industry average. Client complaints that mysteriously disappear after settlement agreements. Vendor contracts that pay 30% above market rates to companies owned by board members' relatives. Would you like me to continue?" Gerald's mouth snapped shut. Catherine, however, was nodding slowly as she read. "This is comprehensive. Aggressive, but comprehensive. You're basically proposing to rebuild the company's entire culture from the foundation up." "Because the foundation is cracked," Darius said. "You can't build something sustainable on a structure that's designed to collapse the moment anyone questions it." He looked around the table, making eye contact with each person. "I'm not here to destroy what works. I'm here to fix what doesn't. The people in this room have a choice. Help me make those fixes, or explain to your next employer why you defended a system that required $4 million in settlement payments." The silence stretched out, heavy with implications and unspoken calculations. Finally, Catherine closed the document and looked at Darius directly. "I'll stay, but I have conditions." "Name them," Darius said. "Complete transparency in the restructuring process. No backroom deals, no predetermined outcomes. If we're actually cleaning this place up, we do it legitimately." She glanced at Preston with something that might have been pity. "And we do it without spending the next year litigating decisions Preston made when he thought he was untouchable." Darius nodded. "Agreed. The goal isn't punishment, it's reform. Anyone who's willing to work within the new structure and commit to ethical practices keeps their position. Anyone who can't make that commitment has 30 days to transition out with a fair severance package." Gerald stood abruptly. "This is insane. Maxwell Aldridge built this company over 40 years, and you think you can just waltz in and remake it in your image because of one street race?" His voice was shaking with emotion now. "Maxwell was my friend. He trusted me to protect his legacy. And I'll be damned if I'm going to sit here and watch you dismantle everything he worked for." "Maxwell Aldridge destroyed my father," Darius said quietly, and the room went completely still. "He accused him of theft, refused to acknowledge evidence of innocence, and let him die in disgrace rather than admit he'd been wrong. That's the legacy you're protecting. So if you want to resign in protest, Gerald, go ahead. But don't pretend you're defending integrity. You're defending a system that worked for you because you were never the target." Gerald's face went through several colors before settling on a mottled red. He grabbed his briefcase, muttered something about talking to his own attorneys, and stormed toward the door. He paused at the threshold, looking back at Preston with something between disappointment and disgust. "Your father would be ashamed," he said, then left. Preston felt those words like a physical blow, not because they were true, but because they weren't. His father would have fought this harder, meaner, dirtier. His father would have found ways to make Darius's life hell, would have weaponized every connection and every dollar to make the victory Pyrrhic. His father would never have signed the agreement in the first place because his father would never have made a bet. He wasn't absolutely certain he'd win. But Preston wasn't his father. He was just someone who'd inherited the armor without the ruthlessness to wear it properly, and now he was watching it get stripped away piece by piece in a conference room that still had his name on the door. The meeting continued for another 90 minutes. 2 more board members resigned on the spot. 3 others, including Catherine, committed to staying through the transition. By the time everyone filed out, the power structure that had governed Aldridge Capital Ventures for 4 decades had been dismantled and reconstituted with Darius Kane at its center. Preston was the last to leave. Darius stopped him at the door. "I need you to understand something," Darius said, his voice low enough that only Preston could hear. "This isn't personal revenge. It's structural correction. You happen to be the catalyst, but the problems I'm fixing existed long before you took over as CEO. Your father created them. You perpetuated them. But you're not irredeemable." Preston looked at him with hollow eyes. "Feels pretty personal." "Because you made it personal at that red light," Darius replied. "You saw me and decided I was someone you could diminish. That's a learned behavior, Preston. Your father taught it to you, and you never questioned whether it was right. But here's what I'm offering you, a chance to unlearn it." By taking everything from me? By removing the structures that let you avoid consequences, Darius corrected. You still have $5 million, no criminal charges, and the opportunity to rebuild your life without the weight of a company that was slowly destroying you anyway. Most people don't get that kind of second chance. Preston wanted to argue, to rage, to demand that this wasn't fair or just or anything except humiliation packaged as mercy. But he was too tired, too hollowed out, too aware that every word Darius said was technically accurate even if it felt like salt in open wounds. What happens to the video? Preston asked finally. It stays private as long as you honor the agreement, Darius said. But Preston, if you try to sabotage this transition, if you attempt to poison current clients or employees against the new structure, if you engage in any retaliation against people who cooperate with the restructuring, that agreement becomes void. And then everyone sees exactly who you were at that red light. Preston nodded numbly and walked out of the building that had been the center of his professional identity for 6 years. His personal items had already been boxed and removed from his office by security, a humiliation Jasmine had orchestrated with efficient brutality. His keycard had been deactivated. His company email would be shut down by end of business today. He got into his car, still the rented Toyota, because he'd sold the Lamborghini 2 days ago to a collector in California for 30 cents on the dollar, needing the liquidity for his divorce attorney because Melissa had filed papers the morning after she'd learned about the bet, and drove aimlessly through Scottsdale, looking at the neighborhoods and streets he'd always considered his territory. Nothing looked the same. The country club where his family had been members since 1971 had quietly suggested he might want to suspend his membership given the current situation. 3 supposed friends had stopped returning his calls. The charity boards he'd served on had requested his resignation. And his mother, living in comfortable retirement in Santa Barbara, had left one voicemail that Preston had listened to exactly once before deleting it. Your father's heart attack would have been kinder than this. Preston found himself driving toward Paradise Valley, toward the intersection where everything had collapsed. The red light was green when he arrived, but he stopped anyway, pulling into the right lane, looking at the spot where Darius's Camaro had been. A horn honked behind him. Preston didn't move. Another honk, longer this time, more aggressive. Preston glanced in his rearview mirror and saw a young man in a BMW leaning out his window. Move it, asshole! Light's green! Preston stared at the kid. Early 20s, expensive sunglasses, the kind of entitled fury that came from never being told no, and saw himself. Saw exactly what he'd looked like to Darius at this same intersection 6 days ago. Saw the ugliness of someone who thought inconvenience was oppression and courtesy was weakness. The light turned yellow, then red again. The BMW swerved around Preston, and as it passed, the driver made an obscene gesture and shouted something Preston didn't quite catch but understood perfectly anyway. Preston sat through another cycle of the light, then another, watching cars pass, watching people go about their lives completely unaware that someone sitting at a red light could lose everything in the space of 30 seconds if they made the wrong choice. His phone buzzed, a text from Richard. Sarah Chen's article drops tomorrow morning, front page. They've interviewed 12 former employees and found documentation of the Marcus Kane incident. Prepare yourself. Preston closed his eyes and rested his forehead against the steering wheel. The article would be devastating. Everyone would know. Every assumption he'd made, every cruelty he'd dispensed, every time he'd used his position to make someone feel small, all of it would be documented, analyzed, and shared. His name would become synonymous with exactly the kind of entitled racism that people claimed didn't exist anymore, because it was usually subtle enough to deny. But Darius had caught it on camera, had documented it, had preserved it in high definition with clear audio and undeniable context. Preston's phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Mr. Aldridge? A woman's voice, young, nervous. My name is Angela Reeves. I used to work in your accounting department until 2 years ago when I filed a complaint about wage discrimination and was asked to resign. Preston's throat tightened. I don't think we should be talking. Probably not, Angela agreed. But I wanted you to know something before the article comes out tomorrow. I'm one of the people Sarah Chen interviewed, and I told her everything, the way your department heads explained that culture fit, meant women couldn't negotiate salaries, the way complaints went into a file that never got reviewed, the way HR's job wasn't to protect employees, but to protect the company from employees. "Why are you calling me?" Preston asked, his voice hoarse. "Because when you pushed back on my complaint, when you implied I was making it up, you said something I've never forgotten." Angela's voice was steady now, gaining strength. "You said, 'People like you always think you deserve more than you've earned.' And I never understood what people like you meant. Was it women? Was it the fact that I went to a state school instead of an Ivy League? Was it because my last name is Reeves and not something your country club friends would recognize?" Preston didn't answer, couldn't answer. "But then I saw the video," Angela continued. "The one that's circulating privately. The one that shows exactly how you talk to people you think are beneath you. And I finally understood. People like you means anyone you've decided doesn't deserve dignity. And I wanted you to know that every person like me, every person you've dismissed or diminished or treated as less than, we all see you now, really see you, and we're not going to be quiet anymore." She hung up before Preston could respond. He sat in his car at the red light where his world had ended, listening to the dial tone, and understood with crystal clarity that the video staying private was almost worse than it going public. Because it meant that everyone who mattered, everyone who'd been hurt, everyone who'd been dismissed, everyone who'd been told they were imagining things or being too sensitive, they all had access to proof that they'd been right all along. The restructuring Darius had planned wasn't just administrative. It was social, cultural, existential. Every person who'd been forced to sign an NDA, every employee who'd left quietly rather than fight, every client who'd felt cheated but lacked the resources to challenge the company, they were all going to be invited back to the table with someone who'd listen. And Preston's legacy would be the proof that their grievances had been legitimate from the start. The light turned green again. This time, Preston drove through it, heading toward the small apartment he'd rented after Melissa had changed the locks on their house. It was in a part of town he'd never lived in before, surrounded by people who worked for a living instead of managing inherited wealth. And every day he parked his rented Toyota next to 10-year-old sedans that their owners actually depended on to get to jobs that mattered. He was learning what it felt like to be ordinary, to be just another person without the armor of money and name and assumed authority. And he was discovering that ordinary was terrifying when you'd spent your entire life being taught that ordinary was the same as worthless. Preston's phone buzzed again. Another text, this time from a number he recognized. His younger brother Marcus, who'd taken their father's death as permission to move to Colorado and start a wilderness guide service, effectively abandoning the family business and everything the Aldridge name supposedly represented. "Heard about the company. Sorry, but also not sorry. Dad's way of doing business died with him. Should have died earlier. Call me if you need someone to talk to who won't judge. Or will judge, but won't charge $600 hour for it." Preston stared at that message for a long time. His brother had been the disappointment, the one who'd rejected their father's values and walked away from easy money to do something he actually believed in. Preston had pitied him for years, had viewed his choice as weakness or rebellion or some kind of existential cowardice. Now he wondered if Marcus had been the brave one all along. He typed a response. "Might take you up on that. Thanks." 3 dots appeared immediately. Then, "Doors open. Literally, I'm fixing a fence. Bring beer." Preston almost smiled, almost. Then he looked at his calendar and saw that tomorrow was Friday, which meant Sarah Chen's article would hit the morning paper, which meant by sunset everyone would know the full story of how Preston Aldridge had bet his company on a street race and lost to the son of a man his father had destroyed. But for tonight, for just a few more hours, he could pretend he was someone who might someday figure out how to be more than the sum of his worst choices. The sun was setting over Phoenix, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that Preston had driven past 1,000 times without noticing. He noticed now. Noticed the way the light hit the mountains. Noticed the way the temperature was finally dropping after another brutal day. Noticed the way the city looked different when you weren't viewing it through the tinted windows of a car that cost more than most people made in 5 years. Tomorrow, the reckoning would go public. But tonight, for the first time in his life, Preston Aldridge was just a man who'd made a catastrophic mistake and was beginning to understand that the hardest part wasn't losing everything, it was figuring out who he was without it. Sarah Chen's article hit the Arizona Republic's website at 6 a.m. Friday morning with a headline that made Preston's stomach turn even before he'd finished his first coffee. How a red light encounter exposed decades of discrimination at Scottsdale investment firm. The story was devastating in its thoroughness. Sarah had interviewed 17 former employees, obtained copies of sealed settlement agreements through sources Preston couldn't even begin to guess at, and somehow acquired internal emails that showed a pattern of discrimination complaints being systematically buried. But the centerpiece of the article was the Marcus Kane story, a full reconstruction of how Maxwell Aldridge had accused an innocent man of theft in 1993, how the charges had been dropped, but the stigma had remained, and how evidence of Marcus's innocence had been suppressed even after his death. Preston read it 3 times, each pass making him feel smaller, before his phone started ringing with calls he had no intention of answering. By 8 a.m., the article had been shared 47,000 times on social media. By 9, it was trending on Twitter with the hashtag #RedLightJustice. By 10, Preston's doorbell was ringing with reporters camping outside his apartment building. He ignored them all and drove to the one place he thought he might find something resembling honesty, his brother's property in Flagstaff, 3 hours north through mountains that offered the mercy of distance from everything collapsing behind him. Marcus's house was a modest cabin on 20 acres of pine forest, with a workshop that smelled like sawdust and a porch that overlooked a valley so beautiful it made Preston's chest ache with something he didn't have words for. His brother was exactly where he'd said he'd be, fixing a fence post with the kind of methodical patience that came from doing work that actually mattered. "You look like hell," Marcus said without preamble when Preston's rental car pulled up the dirt driveway. "Feel worse," Preston replied, getting out with a 6-pack of local IPA that he'd grabbed at a gas station an hour back. Marcus drove the last nail into the fence post, tested its stability with a solid shake, then walked over and took one of the beers. They sat on the porch steps without speaking for several minutes, just drinking and watching the wind move through the pines. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "Read the article this morning. Mom called me crying, said you'd destroyed the family name." Preston laughed bitterly. "The family name destroyed itself. I just finally got caught." "Dad destroyed it," Marcus corrected quietly. "We just grew up thinking it was something worth protecting." He took a long pull from his beer. "You remember when I told Dad I wasn't going to join the company? When I said I wanted to do something that didn't make me feel dirty at the end of every day?" Preston nodded. He remembered. Their father had been furious, had called Marcus ungrateful and naive, and a dozen other things that were designed to wound. "He told me I was weak," Marcus continued. "Said that real men understood that business wasn't about making friends, it was about making money. And I believed for years that maybe he was right. Maybe I was just too soft to handle the real world." He looked at Preston directly. "But you know what I figured out? Making money by making people feel worthless isn't strength. It's just cruelty with a profit margin. And I'm glad I walked away before I turned into someone who thought that was normal." Preston felt something crack in his chest. "When did you get so wise?" "About 2 years into therapy and 1 year into actually liking who I saw in the mirror every morning," Marcus said with a faint smile. "Turns out when you stop trying to live up to a dead man's expectations, you get to figure out what your own values actually are." They drank in silence for a while longer. Then Preston asked the question that had been eating at him since the article dropped. "Do you think Dad knew about Marcus Kane's innocence? Do you think he knew and just didn't care?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Yeah, I think he knew, and I think that's exactly why he buried it. Because admitting he was wrong would have required him to acknowledge that his entire worldview was built on a lie, that being born rich didn't make him better, and that being born poor didn't make Marcus Kane less worthy of dignity." He turned the beer bottle in his hands. "Dad spent his whole life confusing dominance with superiority, and he taught us to do the same thing." "I don't want to be like him anymore," Preston whispered, and saying it out loud made it real in a way that terrified him. "Then don't be," Marcus said simply. "You've lost the company, the money, the status, all the things that kept you insulated from consequences. But you haven't lost the ability to choose who you become next. That's still yours." Preston looked at his brother, really looked at him, and saw someone who'd made peace with being ordinary, with living modestly, with measuring success in terms that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or country club memberships. Marcus had walked away from everything their father had built, and he was genuinely happy in a way Preston had never been, even when he'd thought he had everything. "I don't know how to be ordinary," Preston admitted. "Nobody does at first," Marcus replied. "But here's the secret. Ordinary is just what rich people call normal. And normal is where you figure out whether you're actually worth anything when you don't have money to hide behind." Preston's phone buzzed. Another call, this time from a number he recognized as Sylvia Morrison's office. He answered on the fourth ring. "Mr. Aldridge, this is Sylvia Morrison. I'm calling to inform you that we've received credible information that you've been contacted by several media outlets offering substantial sums for your side of the story." Her voice was professional, but carried an unmistakable warning. "I need to remind you that your settlement agreement includes a non-disparagement clause. Any public statements that paint Mr. Kane or this situation in a negative light will constitute breach of contract." "I haven't talked to anyone," Preston said, his voice flat. "Good. Keep it that way. Because I'm also calling to let you know that we've uncovered additional information during our company audit that could be referred to federal authorities if we choose to pursue it. Specifically, expense reports from 2019 through 2023 that appear to document personal expenses as business costs. We're currently determining whether these represent honest errors or intentional fraud." Preston felt his blood run cold. "Those were approved by accounting. I'm sure you have explanations," Sylvia interrupted smoothly. "And as long as you continue to honor your agreement and cooperate with the transition, those explanations won't need to be tested in court. But if you decide to make this difficult, if you choose to wage a publicity campaign or attempt to undermine Mr. Kane's restructuring efforts, we'll be forced to refer the matter to the appropriate authorities. Do we understand each other?" "Perfectly," Preston managed. "Excellent. Enjoy your weekend, Mr. Aldridge." She hung up before he could respond. Marcus had been listening, his expression sympathetic. "Let me guess. They've got leverage and they're making sure you know it." "Something like that." Preston set his phone down carefully, resisting the urge to throw it off the porch. "They found questionable expense reports. Probably things Dad taught me were normal business practice that turn out to be technically illegal if anyone actually examines them." "Are they legitimate concerns or just pressure tactics?" Preston thought about the golf trips he'd written off as client entertainment, even though no clients attended, the car lease he'd run through the company, the family vacation to Cabo that had been billed as a strategic planning retreat. Probably somewhere in between. Nothing I thought was wrong at the time, but nothing I'd want to defend in front of a prosecutor either. "So they've got you boxed in," Marcus observed. "Can't fight back without risking criminal charges, can't tell your side of the story without breaching the settlement, can't do anything except watch while they reshape everything you thought was yours." That about covers it. Marcus finished his beer and stood up, stretching. "Come on. I need help moving some lumber, and you look like you need to hit something with a hammer. We can talk while we work." For the next 4 hours, Preston did manual labor for the first time in his adult life, hauling 2x4s, measuring cuts, driving nails into boards that would become part of a new deck Marcus was building for a client who'd paid half in cash and half in venison from last season's hunt. The work was hard, mindless, and strangely therapeutic. Every nail Preston drove felt like a small act of creation instead of extraction, and by the time the sun started dropping toward the horizon, he was exhausted in a way that felt honest. They ate dinner on the porch, steaks Marcus grilled with vegetables from his garden, and more beer from the six-pack Preston had brought. The temperature had dropped into the 60s, comfortable in a way that Phoenix never was, and for the first time in weeks, Preston felt something approximating peace. "You could stay," Marcus said as they cleaned up. "I've got extra work if you want it. Pays $13 an hour but includes housing and all the lumber wisdom you can absorb." Preston smiled at that. "I appreciate it, but I need to figure out what comes next on my own." "Fair enough, but the offer stands." Marcus handed him a card with a local therapist's name and number. "This is who I saw when I first moved up here. She's good at helping people untangle family trauma from personal identity. You might want to give her a call." Preston took the card, turning it over in his hands. "Did therapy actually help?" "Therapy helped me understand that Dad's approval was never something I could earn Because it was never actually available, Marcus said quietly. He needed us to fail so he could feel superior. Once I understood that, once I stopped trying to become someone he'd respect, I could start figuring out who I actually wanted to be. He paused. You spent your whole life trying to be him, Preston. Maybe losing everything is the universe giving you permission to try being yourself instead. Preston drove back to Phoenix that night with his brother's words echoing in his head and a business card in his pocket that represented a kind of help he'd always been taught to view as weakness. The city lights appeared on the horizon around midnight, and as Preston descended from the mountains back into the valley, he felt the weight of everything waiting for him, settling back onto his shoulders. The weekend passed in a haze of ignored phone calls and obsessive reading of social media commentary about the article. The story had taken on a life of its own, with people dissecting every detail of Preston's behavior at the red light, analyzing the pattern of discrimination at his company, and celebrating Darius Kane as a hero who'd dismantled a corrupt system through a combination of skill and patience. Preston was variously described as a racist, a fool, a symptom of everything wrong with wealth inequality, and a cautionary tale about ego. All of it was accurate enough that he couldn't even summon the energy to be defensive. By Monday morning, when he was due to return to the office for his final week of transition responsibilities, Preston had made a decision. He called Sylvia Morrison's office and asked for a meeting with Darius. They met at the Kane Racing Academy on Tuesday afternoon. The facility was located in an industrial area of South Phoenix, a converted warehouse that had been transformed into a combination classroom, workshop, and training center. The parking lot held a mix of project cars in various states of restoration, and through the open bay doors, Preston could see students, mostly teenagers, diverse in every way that mattered, working on engines under the supervision of instructors who treated them like the tools in their hands were precious. Darius met him at the entrance, wearing coveralls stained with grease and an expression of mild curiosity. Mr. Aldridge, this is unexpected. I wanted to see it, Preston said simply. The academy. What you built. What you're going to do with the company's money. Darius studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, come on. He led Preston through the facility, explaining as they walked. The academy served students from low-income families, providing not just racing instruction, but comprehensive automotive education, college, preparation, and mentorship. Students learned everything from basic maintenance to advanced engineering, with partnerships that led to scholarships at technical schools and universities. Most of these kids were told they weren't smart enough for STEM careers, Darius explained as they watched a young woman expertly diagnose a transmission problem using laptop diagnostic software. They were tracked into vocational programs and told to be grateful for whatever opportunities they got. But you put them in front of an engine, give them the right tools and actual instruction, and suddenly they're solving problems that would stump most shade tree mechanics. They moved to another area where younger students were learning basic physics through racing simulations, using real data to understand concepts like momentum, friction, and aerodynamics. Preston watched a kid who couldn't have been more than 13 explain to his instructor how weight transfer affected braking distances, using vocabulary that most adults didn't possess. The academy costs about $200,000 a year to run, Darius continued. We've been operating on donations, grants, and my personal savings. It's sustainable but limited. With the restructured company backing it, we can expand to 3 more locations, serve 1,000 students instead of 200, and create actual career pipelines instead of just teaching skills. Preston felt something uncomfortable twisting in his chest. A recognition that the money he'd spent on car payments and country club dues and maintaining a lifestyle built entirely on appearance could have created something like this. Could have actually mattered. Why did you really take the company? Preston asked quietly. If this is all you wanted to fund, you could have negotiated a settlement for cash, taken $50 million and walked away. Why insist on everything? Darius stopped walking and turned to face him directly. Because taking a settlement would have left the structure intact. You'd have been replaced by someone just like you, someone who viewed employees as expenses and clients as resources. The discrimination would have continued with better lawyers writing the settlement agreements. Nothing would have actually changed except who signed the checks. He gestured around the academy. This isn't just about funding programs, Preston. It's about proving that a company can operate ethically and still be profitable. That treating people with dignity isn't a competitive disadvantage. That the system your father built wasn't the only option, it was just the easiest one if you didn't care about the damage you caused. Preston looked around at the students, at the instructors, at the careful way everyone here was being treated like their potential actually mattered. "I never built anything," he said quietly. "I inherited everything and convinced myself that maintaining it was the same as creating it. But this," he gestured at the academy, "this is real. This matters. And I spent years defending a company that existed to extract value instead of create it." "You're not wrong," Darius said simply, "but you're also not done. You still have $5 million, no criminal record, and enough experience to do something productive if you choose to." "I don't know how," Preston admitted. "I don't know how to do anything except what my father taught me. And everything he taught me was—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Wrong isn't the word I'd use," Darius said thoughtfully. "Incomplete is better. Your father taught you how to take. He just never taught you how to build. But that's a learnable skill, Preston. It just requires admitting you don't already know everything." They walked back toward the entrance in silence. At the door, Preston turned back one more time, looking at the space where Darius had created something from nothing, where kids who'd been dismissed by the system were being given tools and trust and the radical belief that they deserved both. "I'm sorry," Preston said finally, and meant it in a way he'd never meant an apology before. "For what I said at that red light. For what my father did to yours. For every time I treated someone the way I was taught to treat people I thought didn't matter. I can't fix any of it, but I need you to know I finally understand how much damage I caused by thinking I was entitled to judge who deserved dignity." Darius regarded him with an expression that was impossible to read. Then he said, "The apology is noted. What matters now is what you do next. You can spend the rest of your life being bitter about what you lost, or you can figure out what you might be able to build with what you have left. Your choice." Preston drove back to his apartment as the sun set over Phoenix, thinking about choices and consequences and the terrifying freedom of having nothing left to lose except the chance to become someone different than he'd been. That night, he called the therapist whose number Marcus had given him and scheduled an appointment for Thursday morning. On Wednesday, Preston attended his final day at Aldridge Capital Ventures. No longer an employee, just someone tying up loose ends and transferring institutional knowledge to people who would use it better than he had. Jasmine Williams was kind but efficient, asking pointed questions about client relationships and vendor contracts without ever once making Preston feel like his answers mattered beyond their immediate utility. Catherine Parks stopped by his temporary desk. They'd moved him out of his office on day one, with a folder of documents that needed final signatures. "How are you holding up?" she asked, and the question sounded genuine. "Honestly, I have no idea," Preston said. "Some days I think I'm handling this okay. Other days I want to burn everything down just to feel like I have control over something." Catherine nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, the changes Darius is implementing are working. Employee morale is up for the first time in years. 3 clients who were planning to leave have decided to stay. And yesterday, 2 people who left the company under your management called to ask about returning under the new structure." Preston felt that uncomfortable twist in his chest again, the one that came from recognizing that his absence was actually making things better. "I'm glad it's working." "Are you?" Catherine asked, and there was real curiosity in her voice. Preston thought about that, really thought about it. "Yeah, I think I actually am, which is weird and uncomfortable and probably means I'm having some kind of breakdown, but yeah, I'm glad the company is becoming something better than what I made it." Catherine smiled slightly. "That's called growth, Preston. Hold on to it." His final task was a meeting with Darius and the transition team to sign documents officially transferring the remaining 51% ownership. The conference room was the same one where Preston had announced his departure to the board 3 weeks earlier, but the energy was completely different now. Purposeful instead of panicked, constructive instead of defensive. Darius laid out the final agreements with characteristic clarity. Preston would receive his settlement in installments over 3 years. The non-disparagement clause remained in effect indefinitely. Any attempt to compete with the restructured company within 5 years would trigger financial penalties. It was thorough, airtight, and completely one-sided. Preston signed everything without hesitation, each signature feeling like the end of one story and the terrifying beginning of another one he didn't know how to write yet. "That's it," Sylvia said, gathering the documents. "As of this moment, you have no legal or financial connection to Aldridge Capital Ventures. The company will be renamed within 60 days to reflect its new mission and leadership." Preston stood up, shook Darius's hand, and walked out of the building for the last time. In the parking lot, he looked back at the modern glass structure that had been the center of his identity for 6 years and felt nothing except a quiet relief that it wasn't his problem anymore. That evening, Preston sat in his modest apartment with a legal pad and tried to list skills he possessed that didn't depend on his last name or inherited wealth. The list was depressingly short. He could read financial statements. He understood contract negotiation. He knew how to manage client relationships, but all of those skills were tied to a worldview he was trying to unlearn, a system he was trying to reject. He thought about the students at the Kane Racing Academy, learning skills that would actually create value in the world. He thought about his brother building decks in Flagstaff, creating something tangible with his hands. He thought about Darius turning a street race into structural reform, using one moment of justice to reshape an entire organization. And slowly, carefully, Preston started writing not a list of skills he had, but a list of things he wanted to learn how to do. How to build instead of extract. How to create value instead of claiming it. How to treat people like their dignity wasn't conditional on their usefulness to him. It wasn't a business plan. It wasn't a path forward. It was just the first honest assessment Preston had ever made of who he actually was versus who he wanted to become. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "How'd the final day go?" Preston typed back. "Survived it. Signed everything. Officially unemployed as of 5 p.m. 3 dots appeared then. "Good. Now you get to figure out what you're actually good at instead of what Dad said you should be good at. It's terrifying and liberating in equal measure. Welcome to the rest of your life." Preston set down his phone and looked at his legal pad, at the list that was equal parts confession and aspiration. Tomorrow he had his first therapy appointment. Next week he was supposed to meet with a career counselor to discuss options that didn't involve inheriting someone else's work. And sometime after that he'd have to figure out how to build a life that wasn't constructed entirely on the foundation of privilege and entitlement he'd always taken for granted. It felt impossible. It felt terrifying. But for the first time in weeks, maybe in his entire life, it also felt honest. Preston had lost everything his father had built and everything he'd thought defined him. But sitting alone in his small apartment with a legal pad full of admissions and aspirations, he was beginning to understand that maybe losing everything wasn't the end of his story. Maybe it was just the first chapter of a story that was actually his own. 6 months after the red light encounter that had ended his old life, Preston Aldridge stood in the lobby of what used to be Aldridge Capital Ventures and was now officially renamed Kane Equity Partners, waiting for a meeting he'd requested and half expected to be denied. The building looked the same from the outside, but everything else had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The receptionist was new. A young man with a bright smile who'd greeted Preston without recognition, which was somehow both humbling and liberating. The corporate art on the walls had been replaced with photographs from the Racing Academy, images of students working on engines and celebrating achievements. Even the air felt different, less sterile and intimidating, more purposeful. "Mr. Kane will see you now," the receptionist said, gesturing toward the elevator. "4th floor, conference room B." Preston rode up alone, watching the numbers climb, and remembering the last time he'd been in this building, signing away everything he'd thought defined him. His reflection in the polished elevator doors showed someone different than the man who'd left 6 months ago. Leaner, dressed in clothes from Target instead of Brioni, with lines around his eyes that came from actual sleep deprivation rather than cocaine and late-night deal-making. Darius was waiting in the conference room with Jasmine Williams and Catherine Park, both of whom had thrived under the new leadership structure. Catherine had been promoted to CFO with actual authority, and Jasmine had transitioned from interim COO to permanent, overseeing operations that had become both more ethical and more profitable in the months since the restructuring. "Preston," Darius said, standing to shake his hand, You said in your email that you had a proposal. I'm curious. Preston set his laptop on the table, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been even when negotiating million-dollar contracts in this very room. I've spent the last 6 months trying to figure out who I am when I'm not my father's son, or a CEO, or any of the things I thought made me matter. And I've realized that the only skill I actually have, the only thing I'm genuinely good at beyond inheriting money, is understanding how wealthy people think. He opened his laptop and pulled up a presentation he'd worked on for 3 weeks. Wealthy people donate to charity because it makes them feel good and offers tax benefits. But most of them have no idea whether their donations actually create change because they never see the impact. They write checks to galas and get their names on buildings, but they don't understand what their money is doing. Darius leaned back in his chair, expression neutral but attentive. Go on. What if there was a consulting service that helped wealthy donors understand impact? Not just where to give money, but how to give it effectively. How to identify organizations that actually create change versus ones that just perpetuate problems. How to measure outcomes, demand accountability, and ensure their wealth creates value instead of just maintaining systems that benefit people like them. Preston clicked to the next slide. I'm calling it ethical equity consulting. The goal would be to redirect wealthy capital toward organizations like the Kane Racing Academy, programs that actually transform lives but struggle to access traditional funding because they don't have the right connections or know how to speak the language of wealth. Jasmine was nodding slowly, her expression thoughtful. It's an interesting idea, but why would wealthy people hire you to tell them their donation strategies are ineffective? That's not exactly a comfortable message. Because I'm one of them, Preston said simply. Or I was. I speak their language. I understand their motivations and their blind spots and their desperate need to believe they're good people, even when they're funding systems that cause harm. I can get in rooms you can't access and have conversations that would sound like accusations coming from anyone else, but sound like advice coming from someone who used to be part of their world. Catherine was studying the presentation with the analytical precision that had made her invaluable to the company's transformation. What's your business model? How does this sustain itself? Sliding scale fees based on donation size, Preston explained. For donors giving under $1 million annually, I'd charge 10% of their total charitable giving. For larger donors, the percentage decreases, but the dollar amounts increase. And for organizations like the Racing Academy, I'd provide free consulting on how to position themselves for funding from the donors I'm advising. So you're essentially a matchmaker, Darius said quietly, connecting wealth to impact. More than that, Preston replied. I'm trying to disrupt the charity industrial complex that lets wealthy people feel good about themselves without actually addressing systemic problems. Most major donors give to universities that already have billion-dollar endowments, or museums that serve primarily wealthy patrons, or hospitals that are already well-funded. They avoid organizations that challenge power structures because that feels uncomfortable. I want to make them uncomfortable in productive ways. Darius was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "Why are you telling me this? Why not just start the company and compete for the same donor base we're trying to access?" Preston met his eyes directly. Because I need help. I have the access and the language skills, but I don't have credibility. I'm the guy who lost his company because of a racist street race bet. That's not exactly a selling point when trying to position myself as an ethical advisor. He paused. But if Kane Equity Partners endorsed what I'm doing, if you were willing to let me use the Racing Academy as a case study, if Catherine and Jasmine were willing to serve as advisory board members, then I'd have legitimacy. I'd be someone who recognized his mistakes and is trying to use his privilege to create actual change instead of just perpetuating harm. Jasmine looked at Darius, then at Catherine, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, Catherine said, "You understand that endorsing you carries risk for us, right? If you fail, or worse, if you revert to the patterns you're claiming to reject, it damages our credibility too." "I know," Preston said, "which is why I'm proposing that 25% of my consulting fees go directly to the Racing Academy as accountability. If I'm actually helping redirect capital effectively, you benefit. If I'm just talking a good game, you still get funding. And if I start operating unethically, you can publicly sever ties and explain exactly why." Darius stood and walked to the window, looking out over Phoenix with his hands in his pockets. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured. I've spent the last 6 months rebuilding a company that your father created and you perpetuated. We've had to undo decades of toxic culture, repair relationships with employees who'd been mistreated, and prove to skeptical clients that we're actually different now. It's been exhausting and occasionally demoralizing work. Preston felt his hope deflating, certain the answer was going to be no. But, Darius continued, turning back to face him, part of what I'm trying to prove is that people can change, that systems can change, that the world doesn't have to operate according to the principles your father taught you. He walked back to the table and sat down. So, here's what I'm willing to do. I'll endorse your consulting practice with 3 conditions. 1, you complete a formal training program on anti-racism and implicit bias, and you do it publicly so people know you're actually doing the work. 2, your advisory board includes at least 2 people from communities that have historically been excluded from wealth, people who can call you out when you're falling back into old patterns. And 3, you give me veto power over any client engagement where I think you're being used to whitewash donations that cause harm. Preston felt something loosen in his chest. I'll do all of that. Gladly. Then you've got your endorsement, Darius said, extending his hand. But Preston, understand something. This is your last chance. If you use this opportunity to rebuild some version of what your father created, if you take advantage of the access I'm giving you to perpetuate harm, I will personally ensure that everyone knows exactly what you did. There won't be a settlement or a private agreement. There will just be consequences. They shook hands, and Preston felt the weight of both opportunity and accountability settling onto his shoulders. This wasn't redemption. He wasn't naive enough to think 6 months of therapy and good intentions erased decades of harm. But it was a chance to build something that created value instead of extracting it, and that was more than he deserved, but exactly what he needed. The formal announcement of Ethical Equity Consulting happened 3 weeks later at an event hosted by the Kane Racing Academy. Preston had insisted on launching it there rather than at some downtown hotel, wanting the setting to make clear what kind of impact he was trying to facilitate. The warehouse space was packed with people, current and former students, donors who'd supported the academy over the years, representatives from other nonprofits doing similar work, and a handful of wealthy individuals who'd expressed interest in Preston's consulting services. Sarah Chen was there too, covering the story for the Arizona Republic with the same thorough attention she'd brought to the article that had destroyed Preston's old life. He'd agreed to a lengthy interview, answering questions about his transformation with as much honesty as he could manage, acknowledging that he was far from perfect but committed to doing better. Mr. Aldridge, Sarah had said during that interview, her recorder running between them. 6 months ago, you lost everything because of choices rooted in racism and entitlement. Now you're positioning yourself as someone who can help wealthy people be more ethical. What makes you think you're qualified to give that advice? Preston had thought carefully before answering. I'm not qualified because I've figured everything out. I'm qualified because I've lived the mindset I'm trying to change. I know exactly how wealthy people justify harmful behavior to themselves because I did it for years. I know the mental gymnastics we perform to avoid acknowledging our privilege because I was an Olympic-level gymnast in that regard. And I know what it takes to start unlearning those patterns because I'm in the middle of doing it, and it's the hardest thing I've ever done. He'd paused, making sure his next words were precise. I'm not claiming to be redeemed or reformed or any other word that suggests I'm done growing. I'm claiming to be useful. I have access to rooms and conversations that people doing actually important work can't access, and I'm offering to use that access on behalf of organizations that create real change. If that makes me a bridge between wealth and impact, then I'll be that bridge. And if I start becoming a barrier instead, I've given people I trust permission to call me out publicly. That interview had run 2 days before the launch event, and the response had been mixed but mostly positive. Some people thought Preston was sincere. Others thought he was rehabilitating his image with a calculated PR move. Everyone agreed it would be interesting to see which version was true. Now, standing in front of a crowd at the Racing Academy with Darius beside him, Preston felt the full weight of what he was attempting. He'd written and rewritten his speech a dozen times, trying to find words that acknowledged harm without centering his own redemption story, that offered value without claiming unearned moral authority. 6 months ago, Preston began, his voice carrying through the space with the help of a modest sound system. I lost everything because I treated someone with contempt based on assumptions rooted in racism and entitlement. I lost my company, my reputation, and the comfortable certainty that money and privilege made me immune to consequences. And I deserved to lose all of it. He paused, letting that acknowledgement sit. What I didn't deserve was a second chance. But Darius Kane gave me one anyway, not because I'd earned it, but because he believes in the possibility of transformation. And I'm standing here today to announce something that I hope will honor that belief: ethical equity consulting, a practice dedicated to helping wealthy donors understand impact and redirect their capital toward organizations that create actual change. Preston gestured to the students working on projects around the warehouse, to the instructors guiding them, to the equipment and space that Darius had built through persistence and vision. This academy exists because one person decided that talent shouldn't be wasted just because it doesn't come from wealthy zip codes. It serves students who were told they weren't smart enough, capable enough, or worthy enough to pursue technical careers. And it proves every single day that those assessments were wrong. He turned to face Darius. My father destroyed Darius's father with a lie in 1993. He had the power to clear Marcus Kane's name and chose not to because being right mattered less to him than maintaining control. That choice rippled forward through decades, causing harm that can't be fully quantified or repaired. What I'm trying to do with this consulting practice isn't atonement for my father's sins or mine. It's an attempt to use the privileges I inherited, access, language, connections, to create positive ripples instead of harmful ones. Preston looked back at the crowd. I'm not asking anyone to forgive me or to believe I've become someone different. I'm asking you to hold me accountable to the standards I'm claiming to represent. If I fail, call me out. If I fall back into old patterns, don't let me hide behind good intentions. And if I succeed in redirecting even a fraction of wealthy capital toward organizations like this one, then maybe something valuable can come from the wreckage of everything I destroyed. The applause that followed was polite but measured, people reserving judgment, waiting to see if actions would match words. Preston was grateful for that skepticism. It felt more honest than easy acceptance would have. After the formal presentation, Preston spent 2 hours in conversations with potential clients and organizational representatives. A foundation director asked pointed questions about his methodology. A tech entrepreneur wanted to know how he'd identify organizations worth funding. A woman who'd worked at Aldridge Capital Ventures during Preston's tenure confronted him about specific incidents of discrimination, and Preston listened without defending himself, acknowledging harm and apologizing without expecting acceptance. Darius watched these interactions from a distance, occasionally interjecting when someone needed additional context, but mostly letting Preston navigate the complicated social dynamics of accountability and attempted transformation. When the crowd finally thinned, he walked over to where Preston stood, looking at a photo display of Academy students. That was harder than I expected, Preston admitted. Having to hear specifically how I hurt people, having to acknowledge it without making excuses. It's supposed to be hard, Darius said. Growth that comes easy isn't usually real. You're going to have a lot more conversations like that if you're serious about this work. I know. Preston was quiet for a moment, then asked the question that had been bothering him since the settlement. Why did you actually give me a second chance? You could have destroyed me completely. You had every right to. Darius considered the question, his gaze on the students visible through the workshop windows. Because my father used to say that the opposite of injustice isn't revenge, it's repair. Taking everything from you felt like justice in the moment, but leaving you with nothing, no path forward, no possibility of growth, that would have just created more damage without creating anything valuable. He turned to look at Preston directly. I gave you a second chance because I wanted to prove that the system doesn't have to operate on the principles your father taught, that there's space for accountability without annihilation, for consequences without crushing people so completely they can't ever become better. And because I figured the worst-case scenario was that you'd take the $5 million and disappear, which would at least remove you from positions of power. The best case was that you'd actually learn something and use your remaining privilege productively. Which one is this? Preston asked. Too early to tell, Darius replied with a slight smile. Check back in 5 years. But Preston, here's what you need to understand. This work you're attempting, this bridge building between wealth and impact, it's not about your redemption. It's about the organizations and communities that benefit if you succeed. The moment you start centering your own transformation instead of the change you're trying to facilitate, you've failed. Remember that. Preston nodded, taking in the weight of that guidance. I'll remember. Over the following months, ethical equity consulting slowly, painstakingly established itself. Preston's client base grew to include 7 wealthy individuals and 3 family foundations, all of whom were genuinely interested in understanding impact rather than just writing checks for tax benefits. He completed the anti-racism training Darius had required, and the experience was humbling in ways that forced him to confront assumptions he hadn't even known he was making. His advisory board included 2 community organizers from South Phoenix who'd spent their careers fighting the kinds of systems Preston's family had benefited from, and they challenged him constantly, refusing to let him fall back into comfortable patterns. The work was harder than anything Preston had done as CEO. Understanding impact required learning entirely new frameworks for evaluating success. Building trust with organizations that had every reason to be skeptical required patience and humility he was still developing. And constantly confronting his own biases and blind spots was exhausting in ways that made his old job look easy by comparison. But it was also the first work Preston had ever done that felt meaningful. One afternoon in late October, nearly 9 months after the red light encounter, Preston was at the Racing Academy consulting with Darius about a potential donor connection when one of the students approached them. The young man was 17, tall and lanky, with grease stains on his academy uniform and an expression of barely contained excitement. "Mr. Kane, I just got accepted," the student said, holding up his phone like it contained proof of miracles. "Full scholarship to Arizona State's automotive engineering program. They said my portfolio from here was exactly what they were looking for." Darius's face broke into a genuine smile, the kind that transformed his usually serious expression into something openly joyful. "Marcus, that's incredible. Congratulations." He pulled the young man into a brief hug, then held him at arm's length. "Your mother know yet?" "Called her first thing. She cried. Like, a lot." Marcus was grinning so wide it looked like his face might split. "Mr. Kane, I wouldn't have even known to apply if you hadn't pushed me. I thought college was for other people who didn't grow up like me. And now I'm going to be an engineer." "You were always going to be an engineer," Darius corrected gently. "The only question was whether anyone would give you the opportunity to prove it. Now go celebrate. And Marcus, I'm proud of you." The young man left, practically bouncing with excitement, and Preston watched Darius watch him go, seeing something in the older man's expression that looked like the opposite of everything his own father had ever valued. This was what impact actually looked like. Not a name on a building or a tax deduction, but a kid whose entire life trajectory had just shifted because someone had invested in his potential. "That's why you do this," Preston said quietly. "Not for the gratitude or the recognition, but for moments like that." "That's why anyone should do anything that matters," Darius replied. "Building things that outlast you, creating opportunities for people who wouldn't have them otherwise, proving that talent is universal even when access isn't." He looked at Preston. "Your father spent 40 years extracting value and calling it success. You spent 6 years doing the same thing, but that kid right there, Marcus, he's going to become an engineer and probably create things that actually matter. That's real success. That's real legacy." Preston thought about his own legacy. The company he'd lost, the reputation he'd destroyed, the years he'd spent measuring success by quarterly earnings and country club status. None of it had created anything that would outlast him. None of it had changed anyone's life for the better except his own, and even that was debatable. "I wasted a lot of years," Preston said. "You did," Darius agreed, "but you've still got years left. The question is what you're going to build with them." They were interrupted by Preston's phone ringing, a number he recognized as belonging to Harrison Sterling, a venture capitalist worth approximately $300 million, who'd hired Preston 2 months ago to review his charitable giving strategy. Preston had spent weeks analyzing Sterling's donations and had come to some uncomfortable conclusions. Mr. Sterling, Preston answered, putting the call on speaker with Darius's permission. I've finished my analysis of your current giving strategy. Excellent. Sterling's voice boomed through the phone. What's the verdict? Am I the benevolent philanthropist I think I am? Preston had learned that honesty was the only approach that worked in this role. No, you're giving $12 million annually to organizations that primarily serve other wealthy people or perpetuate systems that create the problems you claim to care about solving. There was a long pause. Then Sterling laughed, genuinely laughed. I'm paying you $100,000 to insult my charity work? You're paying me to tell you the truth about your impact, Preston corrected. And the truth is that 70% of your donations go to your alma mater, which already has an endowment larger than some countries' GDPs. 20% goes to an arts organization that charges $300 per ticket for performances. The remaining 10% is split between various causes that sound good, but show minimal, measurable outcomes. So what should I be doing instead? Funding organizations that actually need capital and create measurable change. Technical education programs for underserved communities. Legal aid services for people fighting discrimination. Initiatives that address root causes instead of symptoms. Organizations like the Kane Racing Academy, which takes students everyone else has given up on and turns them into engineers and skilled technicians. Sterling was quiet for a moment. Send me your full report and include information on 5 specific organizations you think I should fund. I want financial statements, impact metrics, and your assessment of leadership quality. And Preston, this is exactly why I hired you. Everyone else just tells me my donations are wonderful and asks for more money. You're the first person who's been willing to tell me I'm doing it wrong. They ended the call, and Preston looked at Darius with something approaching hope. That's $200,000 in potential funding for the academy. Maybe more if he likes what he sees. It's more than that, Darius said quietly. It's proof that what you're building actually works, that wealthy people will listen to criticism if it comes from someone who speaks their language and offers a productive alternative. He stood and extended his hand. You're doing good work, Preston. Keep doing it. That endorsement from the man who had every reason to want Preston to fail meant more than Preston had words for. He shook Darius's hand and felt something settle in his chest. Not redemption, not forgiveness, but purpose. The following spring, just over a year after the red light encounter that had destroyed his old life, Preston stood in front of a crowd at a philanthropy conference in San Francisco, presenting a case study on effective wealth deployment. The presentation focused on the Racing Academy as an example of how relatively modest capital, the $200,000 it costs to run annually, could create disproportionate impact when invested in organizations that actually understood and served their communities. In the audience were 47 wealthy individuals and foundation representatives, all of whom had paid $2,000 each to attend the conference. Preston's presentation was titled, "The Cost of Comfortable Giving: Why Your Donations Might Be Making Problems Worse," and he'd been warned that the provocative title might alienate potential clients. Instead, it had resulted in 17 requests for consulting engagements and a waiting list that extended 3 months out. During the Q&A session, a woman in her 60s raised her hand and asked the question Preston had been expecting since he'd started this work. Mr. Aldridge, a year ago you lost your company because of behavior rooted in racism and entitlement. What makes you credible as an advisor on ethical giving? Preston had answered this question dozens of times, but he'd learned that honesty required repeating uncomfortable truths rather than finding easier narratives. Nothing makes me credible except the work I'm doing now and the accountability structures I've put in place. I grew up wealthy, I inherited a company, and I spent years perpetuating harm while telling myself I was successful. I lost everything because I finally got caught treating someone the way I'd been taught to treat people I considered beneath me. He paused, making sure his next words were clear. I'm not here because I've become a better person. I'm here because I have access to rooms and conversations that people doing actually important work can't access. I speak the language of wealth fluently because I grew up surrounded by it, and I'm using that fluency to help redirect capital toward impact instead of ego maintenance. If that makes me useful, then I'll be useful. But I'm not asking anyone to view me as redeemed or reformed. I'm asking you to judge me by whether the organizations I recommend create real change and whether the donors I advise actually improve their impact." The woman nodded slowly. "That's a more honest answer than I expected. Thank you." After the presentation, Preston found himself surrounded by people wanting to discuss specific engagements, organizations they should know about, or methodologies for measuring impact. He fielded questions for 90 minutes, exchanging business cards and scheduling follow-up calls, feeling the strange satisfaction of work that actually mattered. His phone buzzed with a text from Darius. "Saw the live stream of your presentation. Well done. Coffee tomorrow to discuss scaling the academy?" Preston smiled and typed back, "Absolutely. And I think I've got 3 more potential donors for you." That evening, Preston sat alone in his hotel room overlooking the San Francisco Bay and thought about the distance between who he'd been and who he was becoming. He still had years of therapy ahead, still carried shame for choices he couldn't undo, still struggled daily with unlearning patterns that had been ingrained since childhood. He wasn't redeemed. He probably never would be. But he was useful. And for now, that was enough. 2 years after the red light encounter, the Kane Racing Academy had expanded to 3 locations, serving nearly 1,000 students annually, funded in large part by donors Preston had connected to Darius's vision. Ethical Equity Consulting had redirected over $30 million in charitable giving toward high-impact organizations, and Preston had hired 2 additional consultants to help meet demand. The work was sustainable, meaningful, and exactly the opposite of everything his father had taught him to value. One afternoon in March, Preston found himself back at the original intersection where everything had changed. The red light was the same, the country club was still visible in the distance, and the expensive cars still drove through this neighborhood like they owned it. But Preston was driving a sensible Honda Civic now, living in a modest condo, and measuring success by impact metrics instead of account balances. As he waited at the light, a battered pickup truck pulled up beside him in the right lane. The driver was an older Latino man wearing work clothes, probably heading home after a long day of manual labor. Their eyes met briefly through their windows, and Preston nodded in acknowledgement. A simple gesture of recognition between 2 people sharing a moment at a red light. The light turned green. They both drove forward, going separate directions, just 2 people among millions navigating their lives without drama or consequence, or the kind of devastating encounter that reshapes everything. It was the most unremarkable moment Preston had experienced at a traffic light in 2 years, and that ordinariness felt like a kind of peace he'd spent his whole life avoiding without knowing it. Preston's phone rang as he pulled into his condo's parking lot. It was Marcus, calling from Flagstaff with an update on the deck business they'd started together 6 months ago, a small construction company that employed recently released inmates who couldn't find work elsewhere. It was barely profitable, required constant attention, and created value in ways that quarterly earnings reports would never capture. "How'd the Henderson job go?" Preston asked. "Finished today," Marcus replied. "Client cried when she saw it. Said it's the first thing anyone's built for her in 30 years that wasn't about taking something away. Also, 2 of our guys just passed their contractor licensing exams. They're talking about starting their own business next year." Preston felt that familiar warm twist in his chest, the one that came from watching people succeed when given actual opportunities. That's exactly what we're trying to create. Not jobs, but pathways. "Yeah, well, your business strategy of barely break even while creating opportunities is either really noble or really stupid," Marcus said with a laugh. "Our accountant can't figure out which." "Probably both," Preston admitted. "But I'd rather do something meaningful that barely breaks even than something profitable that causes harm." They talked for a few more minutes about schedules and materials and the complicated logistics of running a business that prioritized impact over profit margins. After they hung up, Preston sat in his car looking at his condo, 700 square feet, 1 bedroom, a kitchen the size of his former walk-in closet, and felt grateful in a way that wealth had never taught him to feel. That evening, Preston attended a community meeting about affordable housing in South Phoenix. He wasn't there as a consultant or an advisor, but as someone learning to understand systems from the perspective of people they harmed rather than benefited. He listened more than he spoke, took notes on issues he didn't fully understand, and left with the names of 3 organizations doing work he wanted to learn more about. On his way home, he stopped at a red light. Not the famous one, just an ordinary intersection in an ordinary neighborhood. While he waited, he thought about Darius Kane's question from 2 years ago. What would he build with the years he had left? The answer was still emerging, still uncertain, still far from complete. But it looked like consulting that redirected wealth toward impact. Like a construction business that created pathways instead of just employment. Like showing up to community meetings to listen instead of dominate. Like slow, unglamorous work that measured success by lives changed rather than dollars accumulated. It looked like the opposite of everything his father had built, and that felt exactly right. The light turned green. Preston drove forward into a life he was still learning to build, one choice at a time, accountable to people who refused to let him forget where he'd come from or why that mattered. 3 years after the red light encounter, Preston received an invitation to speak at the Racing Academy's annual fundraising gala. The event had grown from a modest gathering to a major affair attended by hundreds of people, all there to celebrate the program's expansion and the students whose lives had been transformed by it. Preston almost declined. He still struggled with accepting recognition for work that felt like basic decency, but Darius had insisted. People need to see that transformation is possible, Darius had said, not for your sake, but for everyone else who thinks they're too far gone to change. Your story gives them permission to try. So Preston attended, wearing a rented tuxedo he couldn't quite afford, and watched as student after student took the stage to share their achievements. College acceptances, scholarship awards, job offers from major automotive companies, lives rebuilt from ground level up because someone had believed in their potential. When it was his turn to speak, Preston stood at the podium looking out at a crowd that included people who'd been harmed by his old company, donors he'd advised to redirect their giving, and students who'd benefited from funding he'd helped secure. He'd prepared remarks, but standing there in front of everyone, he set aside the script and spoke from a harder, more honest place. 3 years ago, I was sitting at a red light thinking I was better than someone based on the car he drove and the color of his skin. That moment of casual cruelty cost me everything I thought defined me, and I deserved to lose all of it. Preston paused, gathering his thoughts. What I didn't deserve was the opportunity to rebuild. But Darius Kane gave me that opportunity anyway, not because I'd earned it, but because he believed systems could change if people were willing to do the uncomfortable work of growing. He gestured to the students in the audience. These young people represent everything my father's worldview rejected. They're talented, brilliant, capable people who were told they weren't good enough because they didn't come from wealth, or attend the right schools, or know the right people. The Academy proves every single day that those assessments were wrong. That talent is everywhere, but opportunity isn't. That potential doesn't care about zip codes or last names. Preston's voice grew quieter, more intense. I can't undo the harm my family caused. I can't give Marcus Kane his life back or erase the decades of discrimination my company perpetuated. But I can use whatever access and privilege I still have to redirect resources toward organizations that actually create change. I can show up and listen and learn and try to be useful without centering my own redemption. And I can tell anyone who'll listen that being wrong isn't permanent unless you refuse to change. The applause that followed was genuine but measured. People acknowledging growth without erasing harm, recognizing progress without declaring victory. Preston was grateful for that complexity. Easy forgiveness would have felt dishonest. After the formal program, Preston found himself in conversation with Marcus, the student he'd seen get his college acceptance 2 years earlier. The young man was now a sophomore at Arizona State, thriving in his engineering program, already doing research that caught the attention of professors. "Mr. Aldridge," Marcus said, extending his hand, "I wanted to thank you. The scholarship funding you helped secure paid for my books last semester when my financial aid fell through. I wouldn't have made it without that support." Preston shook his hand, uncomfortable with the gratitude but trying to receive it gracefully. "You earned that scholarship through your own talent and hard work. I just helped connect resources to someone who deserved them." "Maybe," Marcus replied, "but Mr. Kane told me your story, about how you lost everything and had to rebuild from nothing. That story helped me when I was struggling. It reminded me that where you come from doesn't have to determine where you end up, and that making mistakes doesn't mean you can't do better." He paused, then added, My dad's been in prison most of my life. Got out last year and can't find work because of his record. I've been thinking a lot about second chances lately, about what it means to believe people can change. So thank you for showing me what that actually looks like. Preston felt something tighten in his throat. Is your dad looking for construction work? Because I'm part of a business that specifically hires people with records. No promises, but if he wants to interview, I can make that happen. Marcus's expression shifted from polite gratitude to genuine hope. Seriously? Yeah, he'd love to interview. Thank you. They exchanged information, and after Marcus left, Preston stood alone in the elegant venue thinking about chains of impact that rippled outward in ways you couldn't predict or control. He'd helped secure funding that kept a student in school. That student might help his father find work. That father might rebuild his life and his relationship with his son. And none of it would have happened if Preston hadn't been forced to confront the ugliness of who he'd been at a red light 3 years ago. Darius appeared beside him, holding 2 glasses of champagne. He handed one to Preston and raised his own in a quiet toast. To transformation. May it never be easy, but may it always be possible. They drank, and Preston asked the question he'd been holding for months. Do you ever regret it? Giving me a second chance instead of just destroying me completely? Darius considered that, his expression thoughtful. There are days when I wonder what would have happened if I'd just posted the video and let the internet do its thing. You'd have been ruined. Everyone would have seen who you really were, and my father's vindication would have been public and complete. He paused. But that would have just been revenge disguised as justice. It wouldn't have changed any systems or helped anyone except maybe my own sense of satisfaction. He looked at Preston directly. I gave you a second chance because I wanted to prove that accountability doesn't require destruction, that people can grow if given the right combination of consequences and support, and because I thought maybe, possibly, you might actually become someone useful if given the opportunity. Was I right? Preston thought about the last 3 years, the therapy, the training, the constant uncomfortable confrontations with his own biases and blind spots. He thought about the donors he'd advised, the organizations he'd helped fund, the lives that had been changed by capital redirected toward impact instead of ego. He thought about the construction business, the community meetings, the slow, unglamorous work of trying to be helpful without being harmful. I don't know, Preston said honestly. I'm trying. Every day I'm trying to be someone who creates value instead of extracting it. But I still make mistakes. I still catch myself falling into old patterns. I'm still learning how to see systems from the perspective of people they harm instead of people they benefit. Then you're right on schedule, Darius said with a slight smile. Because growth isn't a destination, Preston. It's a practice. And the fact that you're still showing up to do the work, still willing to be uncomfortable, still trying to be useful, that's what matters. They stood together watching the celebration continue around them, 2 men whose lives had collided at a red light and who'd both been transformed by that collision in ways neither could have predicted. Preston had lost everything and discovered he'd never had anything real to begin with. Darius had gained a company and proven that systems could change if someone was willing to do the hard work of changing them. And together, in ways neither had planned, they'd created something that looked like accountability without annihilation, consequences without crushing, justice that included the possibility of repair. It wasn't a Hollywood ending. Preston would never be fully redeemed, never escape the reality of harm he'd caused, never stop carrying the weight of his family's legacy. But he'd found something more valuable than redemption. He'd found purpose that existed outside of his own ego, work that mattered regardless of recognition, and the humbling, complicated peace that came from being useful without being central. 5 years after the red light encounter, Preston Aldridge drove his Honda Civic past the intersection where his old life had ended. The light was red. He stopped, waiting patiently, and in the lane beside him, a battered 1972 Camaro pulled up. Blue paint faded by sun and time, primer spots on the quarter panels. A bumper held on with zip ties. Preston looked over and saw Darius Kane behind the wheel, still driving the same car, still refusing to replace something that had value beyond its appearance. Their eyes met, and Darius nodded once. A simple acknowledgement between 2 people who'd been through something together and come out different on the other side. The light turned green. They both drove forward, going their separate ways, carrying the lessons of their collision into a future that was still being written one choice at a time. And Preston thought about what Darius had told him years ago, about junk being what people called value they couldn't recognize. He thought about his father's company, his inherited wealth, his manufactured identity, all the things he'd believed were valuable because other people had told him they were. And he thought about what he'd built in the years since losing everything. Relationships based on honesty instead of utility, work that created impact instead of extracting it, a life that measured success by who he helped instead of what he owned. The old version of Preston would have called his current life junk, too small, too modest, too ordinary to matter. But the man he was still learning to become understood something his father never had, that value wasn't about appearances or price tags or the ability to dominate. It was about showing up with integrity, doing work that mattered, and being willing to change when you discovered you'd been wrong. It was about recognizing that sometimes the most valuable things come in unexpected packages, and that transformation was always possible if you were brave enough to let everything else burn away. Preston Aldridge drove forward into an ordinary afternoon carrying an extraordinary lesson, living proof that karma didn't always wait for the afterlife, that consequences could be teachers instead of executioners, and that sometimes losing everything was exactly what you needed to finally find something worth keeping.